Chapter 116. Family Banquet. Family and Banquet. The whole family sat together to eat. This was called a family banquet. Family banquets were so ordinary that there was nothing special about them. They just needed the whole family to sit together and have a happy meal. Huaxia was very big, so customs may be a little different from place to place. In some places, even the most high-end and expensive restaurant could not be regarded as the highest standard for receiving guests. The real highest standard was to invite the guest to the house for a seemingly ordinary home-cooked meal. Family banquet. She had never eaten a family banquet. The one he had eaten with Yingying before was called a couple's meal. She returned to the main hall and saw the little fellow standing on the chair, quietly eating the dishes on the table. She knew how to use chopsticks, but she didn't like to use them. Usually she ate rice and soup, so she usually used a spoon. She served the main dish today. The little fellow tried a few times and found that she couldn't pick up the dishes, so she simply threw down the chopsticks and grabbed the dishes with her hands. She quietly walked not far from her and coughed softly. Because he was afraid of scaring her, she deliberately lowered his voice. But he didn't expect that such a small voice would startle the little fellow. She immediately threw away the braised goose slice in her hand in a panic. "Papa, I didn't steal it." As she spoke, the little fellow quickly wiped the oil on her mouth. Seeing that her hands and mouth were full of oil, she sat beside her, then took out a tissue and helped her wipe it carefully. As if afraid that her father would be angry, the little fellow immediately pouted and put on a pitiful look. Seeing this, she rubbed her head and said with a smile, "Good girl, eat when you're hungry. It's okay." As he spoke, she stood up and handed her the braised goose leg on the table. The little fellow was a little clever. She knew not to take the biggest and most conspicuous braised goose leg, but only some seemingly inconspicuous braised goose slices. "Papa is so nice." After receiving the braised goose leg, the little fellow was immediately overjoyed. She smiled so widely that flowers were about to bloom on her little face. After taking a big bite, she handed the braised goose back to Big Cat while chewing. She said with a lisp, "Big Cat, come you eat too." Hearing this, the big cat quickly jumped to the little guy's side. After taking a bite, it started to meow. This fellow was a monster that had cultivated successfully, and the spiritual chi of heaven and earth had already washed away the filth on its body, so she didn't mind the little fellow eating with it. She waited for a moment. Seeing that she was happy, he pulled her to his side and looked into her eyes. He said seriously, "Nian Nian, promise me that you won't lie anymore. You can tell me whatever you want. As long as it's reasonable, I'll agree to it. Do you understand?" The little guy was stunned for a moment. After hesitating for a moment, she nodded gently and replied weakly with a pout, "Okay, I won't lie, good girl." She pinched her little face. At this time, Qin Xueqing also walked into the main hall. After seeing her sit down, she turned his head and looked in the direction of the study. To be honest, he still hadn't decided what kind of attitude he should use to face Qin Yongyan. Since ancient times, the relationship between father and son-in-law was slightly better than the relationship between mother and daughter-in-law. But this didn't mean that there wouldn't be conflicts between father and son-in-law. As the saying goes, the more a mother-in-law looks at her son-in-law, the more she likes him. However, there was no uniform way for a father-in-law to look at his son-in-law. Perhaps it was because mature men were more reserved, so they would hide some of their thoughts in their hearts and wouldn't make a conclusion easily. Even if they liked or disliked him, the father-in-law wouldn't easily express it. Before arriving home, Qin Ruiying proposed to eat outside, but she said that he wanted to let her try his cooking. Qin Ruiying couldn't persuade him, so there was this sumptuous meal in front of her. In fact, eating wasn't the main point. Meeting Yingying's father officially was the main point of this dinner. Qin Shi and Qin Yongyan, this father-in-law and son-in-law, had a very subtle relationship. Nian Nian was already 4 years old when Qin Yongyan just found out that he had a granddaughter. And as his son-in-law, Qin Shi showed his invincible power in the village in the morning, showing his absolute power that was beyond imagination. Everything that happened. What kind of experience would Qin Yongyan have? Qin Shi couldn't imagine it from his perspective. After all, he wasn't involved. Anyway, what's done is done, and he had finished eating. His father-in-law couldn't possibly ask him to spit it out, right? After waiting for a while, Qin Ruiying and Qin Yongyan arrived. As soon as they walked into the main hall, Qin Shi was about to get up and greet them. Like Qin Shueching, Qin Shi still hadn't figured out how to address Qin Yongyan. Ying wasn't his legal wife after all. They were already engaged, so it wouldn't be good to call him dad directly. Nian Yin was already 4 years old and she was still calling him grandpa sweetly. But he was calling Qin Yongyan uncle. Wouldn't that seem too distant? How should he address him? It was so annoying. Even an immortal would worry about such trivial matters. While Qin Shi was still worrying, Qin Yongyan's reaction immediately eased Qin Shi's awkwardness. Qin Yongyan followed Qin Ruiying into the main hall. Seeing that Qin Shi was about to get up, he immediately stopped Qin Shi and then said with a smile, "You've worked hard. Sit down." After that, he directly sat down at the head of the table in front of the red sandalwood carving table. After waiting for so long, the children must be hungry. Let's have a taste. Is the master's cooking as good as his swordsmanship? Qin Yongyan said with a smile but quietly made a small joke with Qin Shi. As soon as he said that, Qin Shueching's hand, which was about to pick up the chopsticks, suddenly trembled. She was a Wu Dao guru, but now even holding a pair of chopsticks was trembling. It was easy to imagine how complicated her feelings were right now. After all, she wasn't as shrewd and calm as Qin Yongyan. After secretly glancing at Qin Shi, she picked up the chopsticks and directly started to eat. At this time, Qin Shi got up and pushed the small bowl of golden wings to Qin Yongyan, and then said with a smile, "Sorry to make a fool of myself. This small bowl of golden wings is my specialty. Would you like to have a taste?" "Haha, then I won't stand on ceremony. Please." A seemingly ordinary family feast began amidst this harmonious atmosphere. During the banquet, Qin Yongyan kept chatting with Qin Shi about various trivial matters. Qin Ruiying was responsible for serving the little girl. Only Qin Shueching was restless and felt very awkward. After finishing the rice quickly, she immediately got up and said, "I'm full. Uncle, sister, take your time." After that, Qin Shueching turned to leave. However, at this time, Qin Yongyan suddenly stopped her and asked with a smile, "Shueching, did you talk to your father on the phone?" Qin Shueching nodded and replied, "Yes, they will come back after a while." Qin Yongyan nodded but then suddenly pointed to her seat and said with a smile, "There are guests at home. You can be considered as half the host here. Don't be in a hurry to leave. Sit down for a while." Qin Shueching looked at Qin Yongyan with a little surprise. Seeing that he was looking at her with a smile, Qin Shueching couldn't help but hesitate for a moment, and then reluctantly sat down again. Qin Shi glanced at Qin Shueching. After seeing her sit down, he suddenly said to Qin Yongyan, "Uncle Qin, sorry for calling you like this." Hearing this, Qin Yongyan immediately turned to look at Qin Shi. He still had a smile on his face. He just looked at Qin Shi with a smile and didn't say anything. Seeing this, Qin Shi also smiled. He gently held Qin Ruiying's hand under the table and then said with a smile, "Nian Yin is already 4 years old, but I still owe Ying a romantic wedding. So, I hope to hold this wedding for her under your witness. What do you think? Can you?" Before Qin Yongyan could answer, Qin Ruiying had already turned her head and looked at Qin Shi in a daze. Wedding. She really never thought about it. Qin Shi had actually been keeping this matter in her heart. Drinking wine and growing old together. Chapter 117. Wedding. Qin Ruiying was stunned. That was something she had never dreamed of. Therefore her first reaction was to avoid the trouble. But when she felt the warmth from Qin Shi's hand, after hesitating for a while, she swallowed the words that were about to come out of her mouth. Which girl didn't yearn for love? Which teenager didn't fall in love? 20 years had passed and she was almost 30 years old. Her daughter was already 4 years old. Now that Qin Shi suddenly said that he wanted to hold a wedding for her, why did it sound so awkward? It was very embarrassing. "Oh? Have you decided when to hold it?" As he spoke, Qin Yongyan looked at Qin Ruiying with a faint smile. "I can do it any time, it's up to Ying." With that, Qin Shi turned to look at Qin Ruiying. "Me? How would I know?" Seeing that her father and husband were looking at her, Qin Ruiying hurriedly lowered her head, looking a little embarrassed. Qin Shi was stunned for a moment, then he seemed to have thought of something and couldn't help but laugh. He gently squeezed Qin Ruiying's hand, then said to Qin Yongyan, "I was dictatorial, I should have discussed with Ying first." Hearing this, Qin Yongyan immediately nodded and laughed. "Then you have a good discussion, let me know when you are sure." After saying that, he continued to eat his food. His attitude was a little strange. Could it be, father-in-law had already acquiesced to the fact that what was done? So he was mentally prepared in advance? Qin thought for a while, then threw this question to the back of his mind. He respected his father-in-law, but he wouldn't let his father-in-law's attitude affect his decision. The only person who could really affect his decision was Ying. Qin glanced at Qin Ruiying. He felt that her palm was a little sweaty, so he couldn't help but gently stroke it. There are thousands of people in the world, but do not seek them for the fleeting clouds. A person is like a rainbow, meeting the top will be known. Treasure it as you go. After dinner, Qin Yongyan went straight to his study. Seeing him leave, Qin Xueqing ran back to her room in the east wing as if she was running away. Seeing this, the couple couldn't help but look at each other and shake their heads. Forget it, let's take it slow. Making a family banquet was actually a very tiring thing. Washing vegetables and cooking was very tiring. After eating, one still had to sweep the floor, mop the dishes and wipe the table. Therefore housewives sometimes had a hard time. As a good man of the new era, Qin had the awareness to become a house husband. Therefore when Qin Ruiying wanted to help him clean up, she was directly pushed out by Qin. He asked her to take care of the child and cultivate a good relationship with the little fellow. Shangjing is a city that never sleeps. Hohai Workers' Sports Complex and Sanlitun are all bars, nightclubs and food stalls. Hohai was very lively, but Dongming Alley, which was separated by a lake, was very quiet. This was the taste of old Shangjing. After cleaning up, when Qin returned to the west wing, the little fellow was lying in Qin Ruiying's arms, giggling in front of the TV. When the little fellow saw Qin come in, she immediately sat up, patted the bed and shouted, "Papa! Papa, come and watch cartoons with me. Okay, Papa and Mama will watch with you." Qin got on the bed, and with Qin Ruiying one on the left and one on the right, the little girl was sandwiched between them. The little fellow looked to the left and then to the right. This was the first time she had enjoyed this kind of treatment, so she was immediately very excited. Therefore she turned left and hugged Qin and then turned right and hugged Qin Ruiying. She tossed and turned on the bed and was so happy that she didn't even want to watch cartoons. Looking at the little fellow who kept rolling on the bed, Qin suddenly turned his head and looked at Qin Ruiying. The feeling of tacit understanding came again. Therefore Qin let her play for a while. Seeing that she was too tired to turn over, Qin gently touched her little face and said seriously, "Nian, it's almost time for you to sleep." Hearing this, the little fellow immediately hugged Qin's arm, pouted and said coquettishly, "I don't want to. I'm not sleepy, I want to play for a while more." She really slept too much today. It was only 9 o'clock, so the little fellow was full of energy and didn't feel sleepy at all. Qin helplessly pinched her face and Qin Ruiying secretly laughed. Children are really ignorant. Hindrance. Although he could use magic to make her sleep, Qin obviously wasn't in a hurry to do that, so he had to hold her and watch cartoons again. However, the animation on the children's channel was over, but the little fellow still didn't want to sleep. Qin had no choice but to order a Frozen movie for her. A Frozen movie lasted more than 90 minutes. When she finished watching, it was finally 12 o'clock. "Papa, I'm sleepy." The little fellow raised her little hand and yawned lazily with her mouth open and finally wanted to sleep. Qin was afraid of waking her up, so for the first time he didn't take her to brush her teeth and wash her face tonight. The little fellow held her father in one hand and her mother in the other and soon fell asleep. After gently covering her with the quilt, Qin patted her forehead with a meditation spell. He sat up and said softly to the big cat who was lying at the end of the bed dozing off, "Big cat, go out and don't come back tonight." Meow. The big cat looked at him inexplicably. However, what responded to it was Qin's slightly murderous eyes. Meow. Seeing this, the big cat immediately jumped out. The door was closed, so just as it was about to jump up and open the door, Qin had already opened the door for it. The big cat was stunned for a moment, and then rushed out of the west wing at a faster speed. It was not good to stay here for a long time. After the big cat left, Qin picked up the little fellow and gently put her aside, then moved to Qin Ruiying's side and lay down. Qin Ruiying was lying on the bed, seeming a little nervous. As soon as Qin lay down beside her, she seemed to be stimulated and suddenly sat up from the bed. After hesitating for a moment, Qin Ruiying said with some embarrassment, "Nian is still next to us. She's asleep." "Aya." Qin Ruing gently swatted away the devil's claws that wanted to play tricks. She bit her red lips and opened her mouth to say something, but Qin had already kissed her gently. She turned around to face the flowing snow, climbing onto the bed to hug the beautiful Tsong. Mandarin ducks dancing neck to neck, jadeite encirclement. Eyebrows together bashfully, lips red and warm. Fresh and fragrant, skin smooth and jade-like. Weak and languid wrists so tender and lovable. Beads of sweat, messy green hair. After 1,000 years of happiness, I've heard of 5 nights of poverty. The time to linger is limited, the love is hard to end. It was the beginning of a break. Ying, do you want to try in the sky tomorrow? In the sky? Qin Ruing was stunned for a moment, but then she shyly spat at him. Bah! How can you think of that, shameless? We're an old married couple, what's there to be shy about? Hearing that, Qin Ruing pretended to be angry and threatened him. I'm going to be angry. Seeing that, Qin immediately raised his hands to surrender. Okay, I won't say it. Humph. The two of them lingered for a while. Qin hugged her and suddenly asked seriously, Ying, are you looking forward to our wedding? Qin Ruing looked at him quietly in the dark and did not answer immediately. She gently leaned her head on Qin's chest. Then with a sense of relief she suddenly sighed and said, I didn't dare to think about it before, so I never thought about it. Thank you. Chapter 118. After the couple spent some time together, the date of the wedding was finally set. December 12th. Half a month later. There was no special meaning to it. Qin just wanted to do it as soon as possible, so he chose December 12th after thinking about it. 12/12, 122, I wanna love. It felt good and auspicious, so let's do it on that day. Qin Ruing gave it some thought and let him make the decision. In fact, she didn't have any special ideas, thinking that it just needed to be simple. As long as she could marry Qin under the witness of her father, she would have no regrets in this life. However, Qin also wanted to hold a romantic wedding for Ying because he had experienced Fong Lei's high-end cruise wedding. Qin Ruing didn't agree. Not to mention that Qin was all alone, even she didn't have many relatives or friends. So even if the wedding was grand, how many guests could they invite to attend the ceremony? It was a make-up wedding anyway, so it was fine to just give her a simple blessing. Qin agreed with her with a smile. The next day, when the little girl woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. Qin leaned against the bed and looked at her with a smile. The little girl didn't seem to be awake yet. She stretched, squinted at her father next to her, and then rolled on the bed directly into Qin's arms to continue to sleep. The couple sat side by side on the bed, quietly looking at the little girl who was sleeping in Qin's arms. Suddenly they looked at each other again. Then they both laughed. Maybe this was the happiest thing in the world. These 2 days there would be light snow from time to time. It wasn't heavy, but it was enough to make the snow pile on the ground higher and higher. The weather was good today. After the snow at night, it was sunny during the day. Qin Xueqing might feel that it was not good to eat Qin's food for free every day. So when Qin went to the kitchen, he found that she had already bought breakfast and put it in the thermal cabinet. His sister-in-law was actually a very domineering person. However, her brother-in-law was stronger than her. She was so domineering that she could no longer raise her head in front of Qin. Because the little fellow had gone back to sleep, it was already 9 o'clock in the morning by the time Qin Ruing took her to wash up and get up for breakfast. Her sister-in-law was a very particular person, so the breakfast she bought was naturally not the porridge and steamed buns from the roadside stalls. He didn't know where she bought these Cantonese morning snacks, but just looking at them was enough to whet his appetite. Because they woke up too late, Qin Xueqing and Qin Yongyan had already eaten, so Qin directly took the breakfast back to the West Wing. The little girl liked barbecued pork buns and shrimps very much. After taking a bite of each dish, the little girl held the roast pork bun in one hand and the shumai prawn in the other. Her mouth was as big as a squirrel stealing pine nuts, but she didn't forget to nod and praise the deliciousness. Perhaps it was because the weather was too cold, so after breakfast the little girl ran to the bed again to watch cartoons. This was a bad habit. So under Qin's strong request, she had to obediently follow Qin to the yard and prepare to build a snowman with her father. However, perhaps it was because Qin had built a super large snowman for her before. Therefore, the little girl didn't want to build anymore after a while because she was afraid of the cold now. Qin Shi was a little speechless, so he had to begin to reflect on whether there was something wrong with his education of his child. He felt that Nian Yan was becoming more and more disobedient now. Especially after Qin Ruiying came back, she often acted coquettishly and wanted to watch cartoons. And the person she acted coquettishly to was not him. It had only been a day, but she was getting closer and closer to her mother. It was probably because Qin Ruiying had just seen her daughter, so she wanted to be obedient to her. If Qin Shi hadn't stopped her, Qin Ruiying would have even taken her back to watch cartoons. She was afraid of the cold and didn't want to stay outside, but when she entered the house she wanted to watch cartoons. This cartoon definitely couldn't be watched. It was not right to be cooped up at home all day, so she had to exercise. So Qin Shi called the big cat. This guy was comfortable in bed last night, but was suddenly driven to the main hall by Qin Shi to be exposed to the cold wind. Now it was still full of resentment. But when Qin Shi called it, it didn't dare to disagree, so after a meow, it ran over obediently. You change back and take Nian Yan to run a few laps in the yard. Meow. The big cat was a little reluctant and tried to protest with a few meows. Protest was invalid, so it could only obediently change back. This trick was effective. When the little girl saw the big cat change back to its original form, she was immediately attracted. Without Qin Shi's reminder, she quickly rushed over and hugged the big cat. The big cat was very cooperative and the little girl sat on it very skillfully. Big cat. Let's go. Go go go. Obviously it was the big cat doing the work, but because the little girl was too excited she kept shouting, so it didn't take long for her to be tired and gasping for breath. Qin Shi stood on the steps outside the west wing, looked at the little girl running in the yard, and then looked at his lonely wife beside him. Suddenly he felt that he might already be the happiest person in the world. Winner in life. This feeling was really good. Qin Shi looked up at the sky. The wind and snow had just stopped, and the sky in Shangjing was as blue as it was on National Day. Was this the feeling of happiness? After the washing of time, after the lights waned, one would understand the preciousness of dullness. Thinking of this, Qin Shi couldn't help but gently hold Qin Ruiying's hand. He suddenly turned to her and said, "Ying, I suddenly have a new life goal." Life goal? Hearing this, Qin Ruiying looked at him with some doubts. Seeing his serious face, she immediately couldn't help but chuckle and say, "It's broad daylight, don't make trouble." She thought that Qin Shi was going to play a joke on her again. However, Qin Shi looked at her quietly for a few seconds, but suddenly said to her very seriously, "Ying, I love you. If I have to put a time limit on this love, I hope it's..." Speaking of this, he suddenly paused and then solemnly said the time limit he wanted. "Eternal life. I hope you can be by my side forever. Together with me we'll see the end of time." Qin Ruiying was stunned. But then, she threw herself into Qin Shi's arms, just like in the school playground, and took the initiative to raise her head and kiss Qin Shi's mouth. After a long time, the two reluctantly let go of each other. Qin Xueqing stood outside the east wing, watching them show their love unscrupulously in public, and immediately snorted angrily. At this time the little fellow rode Big Cat to her side. The little fellow raised her little head again and asked sweetly, "Aunt, do you want to play with me?" Qin Xueqing hesitated for a moment. Then she touched her little head and said softly, "No, you have fun with Big Cat." Big Cat, let's play." After watching the little fellow ride Big Cat away, Qin Xueqing hesitated again, and then quickly walked through the yard to the steps outside the west wing. She raised her head slightly. Chapter 119. The timing of the sister-in-law's request was very strange. Qin Shi had just finished showing off his affection with her sister, and she was asking for guidance. However, her tone was not very polite, as if she felt that asking Qin Shi for guidance was a very embarrassing thing. Her stiff attitude made it impossible for others to feel her sincerity. Sister-in-law was arrogant. Qin Shi lowered his head and looked at her but did not answer immediately. At this time Qin Ruiying suddenly squeezed his hand slightly, clearly reminding him to answer quickly. Before the husband said anything, the wife had already started to whisper pillow talk. Qin Shi smiled and looked at Qin Ruiying. Then, under Qin Xueqing's slightly expectant gaze, he suddenly shook his head and said softly, "No." Qin Xueqing was stunned. Qin Ruiying was also stunned. The two sisters looked at Qin Shi in disbelief. They obviously did not expect Qin Shi to refuse. Obvious Jing, Inward Jing, Peak Jing, Dan Stage, Alcade Stage, Invincible Stage, Diviner Stage. Qinshi was already standing at the peak of this world. Those who had reached the controlled Dan stage were called Grandmasters. But after reaching the Grandmaster stage, Qin Xueqing realized how difficult it was to go further. Qinshi was a diviner. As long as he casually gave her some guidance, it would definitely be a great help to her. Her idea was good, but she really did not expect that Qinshi would refuse her directly in front of her sister. Qin Xueqing became angrier and angrier the more she thought about it. In a fit of anger, she immediately turned around and walked back to the east wing. Qin Ruoying knew her sister's temper, so she immediately pulled Qinshi, wanting to intercede for her sister. However, before she could say anything, Qinshi sighed softly and suddenly stopped Qin Xueqing. I have never learned martial arts. How do you want me to give you guidance? Why don't you show it to me first? Hearing this, Qin Xueqing immediately stopped. She was a Wu Dao Grand Master, but now she was asking for guidance from a necromancer. It did seem a little unreasonable. However, Qinshi was ultimately at the celestial being realm. His horizons were definitely not something that ordinary people could compare to. Thus, after thinking for a while, Qin Wanqing turned around and said, "Okay, I'll play it for you first." After saying that, she walked to the center of the courtyard and got into a starting position. The Qin clan's inherited martial art, Mother-Child Soft Palm. The Mother-Child Cotton Palm had a total of 9 forms, and each form had 6 variations. There were a total of 54 forms and each form had a molecular variation. Therefore, the Mother-Child Cotton Palm had a total of 108 forms. In the small courtyard. In a slightly tipsy winter day, Qin Xueqing proudly stands alone, holding her breath. As a Grand Master of the Dan stage, she had long cultivated the martial Dao from the vocal realm to the silent realm. Suddenly she moved. Her lotus steps moved slightly, and her posture was exquisite beyond compare. Light clouds danced gracefully as her sleeves fluttered in the wind. Suddenly she was as ethereal as a light cloud, and suddenly she was like a magpie startling its nest. A set of mother-child cotton palm which was soft but firm came out from her hands. It was not like a martial art but more like a dance. As it fluttered and danced, it was like a snow lotus blooming angrily. The little fellow who was riding the big cat and wandering around was attracted by her dance, so she immediately rode the big cat back to Qinshi's side. She looked up and asked, "Papa, is Auntie dancing?" Qinshi bent down and picked her up from the big cat and then asked with a smile, "How is it? Is Auntie dancing well?" "Yes." The little fellow immediately nodded heavily and suddenly said with some expectation, "I also want to learn." Hearing this, Qinshi kissed her little face and laughed. "Auntie is dancing the mortal dance. When you grow up, Papa will teach you the immortal dance and let you become a fairy like Sister Chang'e, okay? Teach me, Papa." The little fellow put her arms around Qinshi's neck and immediately giggled. The 108 moves were soon finished. Qin Xueqing stopped and stood still. She raised her head and looked at Qinshi again with some expectation in her eyes. Qinshi did not speak immediately because after seeing Qin Xueqing's performance, he suddenly remembered the moves that great-granduncle used when fighting with him. It was beyond the scope of martial arts. The environment of the earth was not suitable for cultivation, so martial arts itself was a deformed product under the influence of the environment. This was a dead end. There was no way ahead. However, great-granduncle had obviously found another way. Therefore, after pondering for a while, Qinshi looked at Qin Xueqing and said softly, "That's it. I'll think about it first and give you an answer tomorrow." Qin Xueqing looked at Qinshi with a complicated expression, and then turned back to her room in the east wing. After his sister left, Qin Ruoying turned to look at Qinshi and suddenly asked thoughtfully, "You're so powerful now, is it because of that place in your memory?" She had seen Qinshi's memory. Although it was only the first few years, it was enough for her to understand that there was a place called the Heavenly Jade Domain in this world. The people there were very powerful. Qinshi looked at Qin Ruoying. Seeing her worried look, he could not help but smile. "It's a very long story. Let's go, I'll tell you slowly." The couple brought the little fellow back to the west wing. Then Qinshi told Qin Ruoying the story that had lasted for 500 years. Heavenly Jade Domain, Immortal Cultivators. Heavenly Domain, Heavenly Yen Sect. Odd Job Disciple, Dawn Divine Lord. Starting from the heavenly jade domain, he entered the heavenly yen sect and became an odd job disciple. In the end, he stood out from countless odd job disciples and became an official disciple of the divine sect, officially beginning his path of cultivation. The story was very long and very unbelievable, so Qin could only tell the main points. Qin Ruiying became more and more confused as she listened. Until she heard Qin say that he had lived in the heavenly jade domain for a full 500 years. She could not help but open her mouth and say in shock, 500 years? She originally thought that Qin had only gone to a mysterious place like a village to learn cultivation. Only now did she finally understand. Qin had gone to another world. A place infinitely far away from Earth. A place where the flow of time was completely different from Earth. It was too unbelievable. Qin Ruiying digested it for a long time, but she still could not accept it. What she cared about was not the immortal cultivators, nor the heavenly jade domain. What she cared about was the 500 years that Qin said. She had lost Qin for 5 years. But Qin had lost her for a full 500 years? A person living alone in a completely unfamiliar place for 500 years? And after 500 years, Qin still remembered her? After going through so much just to come back and find her? Qin Ruiying stared at Qin in a daze. She would not doubt his words, which was why she felt that it was somewhat unacceptable. What did 500 years mean? Qin Ruiying really could not imagine it. She stared at the lover in front of her in a daze. Suddenly, she seemed to understand what Qin meant by eternal life. Qin looked at Qin Ruiying. When he saw her dazed expression, he immediately regretted it. He really should not have told Ying such an unbelievable thing. He should have optimized this story and told her in a way that Ying could understand. Qin regretted it a little. However, the next moment, Qin Ruiying suddenly threw herself into his arms. She looked up at her lover's face and suddenly burst into tears. I love you. If I have to put a time limit on this love, I hope it is. Chapter 120. Immortality. It was the ultimate dream of countless people, but it was obviously impossible to achieve. Although cultivators had a long lifespan compared to immortality, what was a few hundred years? Qin was in the deification stage, so his lifespan could reach at least 2,000 years. This also led to a problem in front of him. After all, Qin Ruiying was just a mortal. Living over 100 years old was already a long life. Qin could live for 2,000 years, but Qin Ruiying couldn't accompany him for 2,000 years. 5 years was enough for time to leave a trace of imperceptible traces on her face. Let alone 2,000 years. After going through so many hardships, he finally found his lover. Would he have to watch her wither in his arms after a few decades? Qin would never allow such a thing to happen. Absolutely not. He had no delusions about immortality. Because he knew that immortality was an unrealistic fantasy. No one could live forever, but if it was only a few decades, Qin felt that it was too little. So he wanted to help Ying borrow another 500 years from the heavens. A cultivator in the gold core stage could have a lifespan of 500 years. Therefore, the moment this idea appeared in Qin's mind, it took root and sprouted almost immediately, growing into a towering tree. He must help Ying reach the gold core stage. Although the spiritual aura of heaven and earth was thin, there were still hidden masters who were close to the gold core stage like great-granduncle. Without the inheritance of cultivators, great-granduncle could reach this step. What's more, he was holding Qin Ruiying's hand and walking. He was just a gold core. Thinking of this, Qin immediately guided Qin Ruiying to find the sense of qi. To become a cultivator, the first step was to find the sense of qi. Only after detecting the existence of the spiritual aura of heaven and earth could one use a secret method to refine the spiritual aura into one's own true essence and gather it in one's dantian. If one couldn't even detect the spiritual aura of heaven and earth, then what was the point of cultivating? The sense of qi was a mysterious feeling beyond the 5 senses. There were some talented individuals who didn't even need anyone to teach them. They could awaken their sense of qi when they were still in their infancy and instinctively refine the qi of heaven and earth. However, such geniuses were rarely seen. Therefore, if one really wanted to talk about it, humans, who were the wisest of all living things, were inferior to demons in this aspect. For example, Big Cat. It was originally a wild leopard that lived in the mountains. One day, when it suddenly awakened its sense of qi, it relied on its instincts and slowly stepped into the spirit gathering stage. As more and more spirit qi accumulated, the big cat naturally reached the wisdom realm. Now that it had gained sentience, it could be considered to have truly stepped onto the path of cultivation. It was impossible for Qin Shi to hide anything from Qin Ruing. Therefore he took out the best cultivation technique he had, the treasure of the Sky Yen Divine Sect, the Sky Yen Divine Canon. The cultivation method is the best, but Qin Ruing doesn't know what's wrong with her. She tosses and turns for a whole night but still can't find any qi. It was true that the spiritual energy on Earth was sparse. However, the person sitting next to her is a spirit formation stage expert. Qin Shi even used his own true essence to completely wrap her up. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that every breath she took was pure true essence that had been refined by Qin Shi. It was even purer than the original heaven and earth spirit qi. However, even so, Qin Ruing still can't find any qi. To find the qi, a slower person would need a few hours, while a faster person would only need a few minutes. For example, Qin Shi's method of using true essence to directly wrap her up is practically cheating. Unfortunately, she still can't feel it. There's no other way. Qin Shi doesn't want to give her too much pressure, so he can only lie to her and say that everything is difficult at the beginning, and let her try again tomorrow morning. Qin Ruing can't even be considered as a martial artist, her physical strength is already weak. After tossing and turning for an entire night, she is also tired, so she didn't suspect anything and fell asleep while hugging Qin Shi. The next day, Qin Xueqing bought breakfast as usual. After breakfast, Qin Shi took the little fellow to do morning exercises in the courtyard. Qin Ruing stayed in the house to continue to search for the qi. However, until lunchtime, Qin Ruing still can't find the qi. At this time, Qin Shi can't help but feel anxious. Immortal cultivators are divided into realms, and every time a cultivator crosses a major realm, they will have an extraordinary transformation. However, the advancement of this realm is extremely difficult. Many people with mediocre aptitude may even be trapped in the qi refinement stage for their entire lives, and can't make any progress. He has been in the Tianyuan world for more than 500 years, and he has never heard of anyone who can't find the qi. If you can't find the qi and can't even enter the door, what kind of cultivator are you? Could it be? Is it because the cultivation methods of the Tianyuan world can't be used on Earth? Thinking of this, Qin Shi immediately found Qin Xueqing, and then taught her a set of ordinary cultivation methods. Qin Xueqing thought that Qin Shi taught her the cultivation method of the necromancer, so she immediately began to search for the qi according to what he said. However, Qin Xueqing and Qin Ruing are in the same situation. The two of them struggled until the afternoon, but still couldn't find the qi that Qin Shi was talking about. If they can't find the qi, it means that they can't cultivate. The matter is a bit serious. Qin Shi hesitated for a moment and then took the set of cultivation methods to Qin Yongyan, and prepared to let his father-in-law try it. Qin Yongyan is also a Dan stage grandmaster. After seeing how powerful Qin Shi is, he has always been very interested in Qin Shi's cultivation methods. So now that Qin Shi came to him with the cultivation methods, Qin Yongyan immediately smiled and practiced according to what he said. The same treatment as Qin Xueqing. As soon as Qin Yongyan closed his eyes, Qin Shi wrapped him with vital essence. However, after a few seconds, Qin Yongyan suddenly opened his eyes and chuckled. Is this the qi sense you were talking about? It's really a strange feeling. You feel it. Qin Shi's expression changed abruptly. He immediately withdrew his vital essence and then asked nervously, then try again. See if you can absorb the surrounding spiritual qi into your body through the set of cultivation methods. Okay, I'll try. Qin Yongyan sat cross-legged on the ground with his hands on his knees, and then practiced according to the cultivation methods given by Qin Shi. Qin Shi looked at Qin Yongyan nervously. After about 10 minutes, Qin Shi suddenly felt that the spiritual qi around Qin Yongyan began to flow slowly. Although it was extremely weak, it proved that there was nothing wrong with the cultivation methods. He could cultivate. Since there was no problem with the incantation, then what was the problem? With a stomach full of doubts, Qin Shi quickly returned to the west wing. Qin Ruing was sitting on the bed trying hard to find the qi. After hearing Qin Shi say that cultivation could prolong life, she was completely moved. After all, if possible, who wouldn't want to live a few more years? He worked very hard, because she also wanted to be with Qin Shi forever until the end of time. The little girl sat on the bed watching cartoons while curiously looking at Qin Shi and Qin Ruing. Chapter 121. Since Qin Yongyan could cultivate it, it meant that there was nothing wrong with the cultivation technique itself. The Sky Yen God Sect's cultivation technique was based on righteousness and there were no shortcuts. However, it was a path that led straight to the Mahayana realm. Of the two cultivation techniques, one was the foundational cultivation technique for new disciples and the other was the Sky Yen God Sect's secret scripture. However, to cultivators in the Qi refinement stage, there was no difference between the two cultivation techniques. The great Tao flowed like mercury and every grain was round. It was impossible for the Sky Yen God Sect to keep their cultivation techniques to themselves. Allowing new disciples to cultivate incomplete foundational cultivation techniques was undoubtedly a foolish method of self-destruction. Qin Yongyan could cultivate it but Qin Ruiying and Qin Xueqing could not sense qi. This made Qin Shi very suspicious. If it was not a problem with the cultivation technique, could it be gender? However, that was obviously impossible. The Sky Yen God scripture did not have any requirements to be passed down to males and not females. As the sect master's daughter, Yu Zijin had cultivated the Sky Yen God scripture earlier than him. Before Qin Shi left, Yu Zijin had already successfully stepped into the divine transformation stage and was given the title of Goddess Zijin. What exactly was the problem? Qin Shi stood beside Qin Ruiying and looked at his lover's diligent appearance. The pressure in his heart increased. He could help her refine pills to forcefully raise her cultivation, but that would be meaningless. Was it really that difficult to sense qi? Qin Shi was at a loss. At this moment, the little guy who was sitting on the bed was suddenly amused by the cartoon and laughed a series of loud laughter. Qin Shi looked at the little fellow. After thinking for a while, he came to the little fellow's side and asked softly, "Nian Nian, can you help Daddy with something?" Hearing this, the little fellow immediately jumped into Qin Shi's arms and laughed. "Okay. What can I help Daddy with?" "And sit properly first and then follow Daddy's instructions to sense." Under Qin Shi's guidance, the little guy assumed a proper posture with his 5 hearts facing the sky. After that, Qin Shi gently rapped her with his true yuan. "Nian Nian, use your heart to sense. Are there many things floating around you like dandelions?" The little fellow obediently closed her eyes and sensed for a while, but she did not feel anything. Thus she wrinkled her little nose and sniffed around like a cute puppy sniffing around. Qin Shi looked at her appearance and knew that she was unable to calm her heart. Nian Nian was still too young and it seemed like she was unable to understand what he meant. Thinking of this, Qin Shi couldn't help but sigh, ready to give up. He actually wanted to let a child to try. However, the little fellow's happy's true. "Daddy, I see a lot of the bubbles." She did not it was that she was with her eyes was with Lin. The little fellow happily stretched out her fingers and kept poking in the air. Seeing this, Qin Shi was stunned. Nian Nian, this naughty little girl, could sense the qi? Because he was a little suspicious of the little fellow's feeling, Qin Shi deliberately scattered his true yuan and guided her to find it. However, what Qin Shi did not expect was that the little fellow could actually accurately point out the location of each ball of true yuan. "It's so fun. It's so fun." The little guy closed his eyes and started to shout happily. In the darkness, she felt that there were countless glowing bubbles around her, slowly flowing around her. Qin Shi withdrew his true yuan. The spiritual qi of heaven and earth was too thin, so the moment he withdrew his true yuan, the little fellow immediately lost her sense of the spiritual qi of heaven and earth. "Daddy, it's gone. The bubbles are gone." The little fellow pouted and opened her eyes. Then she lay on the bed looking for the bubbles that came out of nowhere. Qin Shi looked at the little fellow silently. He would not consider letting the little fellow start cultivating for the time being. After all, Nian Nian was only a 4-year-old child and this was not the Tianyuan world. In the future, Nian Nian would have to go to school. Qin Shi did not want her to become an anomaly. An anomaly among children would be ostracized. After coaxing the little fellow to watch cartoons, Qin Shi looked at Qin Ruiying. If even Nian Nian could cultivate, then there was obviously something wrong with the two sisters. At this time, Qin Ruiying had already stopped cultivating. She heard the little fellow's movements. Seeing that her daughter could immediately find the feeling that Qin Shi said, Qin Ruiying's face darkened. She said sadly, "Maybe I'm too stupid." Hearing this, Qin Shi sat beside her, gently held her hand and comforted her. "Everything is difficult at the beginning. Children are the spirits of heaven and earth and have not been affected by the turbid qi of the world, so it's easier for them to find that feeling than adults. In order to prevent her from doubting him, Qin even used his sister-in-law as an example to comfort her. You're not stupid and neither is Hua Qing. Hua Qing reached the martial Dao master realm in her 20s. She's already a rare martial arts genius in this world. Even a genius like her can't find the qi, let alone you, an ordinary person who has never cultivated before. Don't worry, don't pressure, let's take it slow. Okay, then I'll try again. After hearing Qin's words, Qin Ruiying immediately relaxed a lot. Even Hua Qing could not learn it. It could be seen that what Qin taught them must be much more difficult than martial arts. Therefore it was normal for her not to be able to learn it in a short time. Thinking of this, Qin Ruiying immediately relaxed a lot. After smiling at Qin, she closed her eyes and began to cultivate again. However, she was no longer stressed, but the pressure in Qin's heart was increasing. After leaving a ball of vital essence to gently wrap her up, Qin quietly walked out of the west wing and then went to the main room to find Qin Yongyan. The Qin family's courtyard house was on the west coast of Shikahai. A little further down was the center of Hua Xia's power, Songnanhai. Qin had been back on Earth for so long. Based on the places he had been to so far, Songnanhai's spirit energy was only second to Qinling. It was definitely an excellent place to cultivate in seclusion. Qin Yongyan had been sitting in the main room cultivating. After tossing and turning for the whole afternoon, when Qin once again walked into the main room, she could even see a trace of cloud rising around Qin Yongyan's body. This was the manifestation of the condensed spirit energy of heaven and earth. It also meant that Qin Yongyan had begun to try to refine the spirit energy of heaven and earth. Qin did not tell Qin Yongyan the truth. He simply described the problem that the sisters were facing now. Qin Yongyan was very smart. Therefore he immediately understood that Qin was hinting him not to mention cultivation in front of the sisters, so as not to bring unnecessary psychological pressure to them. Qin was in charge of dinner. After the meal was served, under Qin's constant urging, Qin Xueqing reluctantly walked out of the east wing. However, after she was at the table she just ate 2 mouthfuls and then said that she was full. After that she quickly returned to the east wing, closed the door and continued to cultivate. Her sister-in-law was obsessed with martial arts. Otherwise she could not have reached the Dan stage at this age. Qin showed her a new way, so now she was in high spirits. She must find the qi sense that Qin mentioned. Perhaps it was due to her sister's influence, but Qin Ruiying's mood gradually improved. Qin knew what she was thinking, so he patted his chest and said that in the future he would take care of the children and do the housework. She only needed to concentrate on cultivating. Hearing this, Qin Ruiying went back to her room and continued to cultivate. There were only 3 people left in the main hall. Qin and Qin Yongyan ate silently, while the little fellow took care of the big cat very generously. At this time, Qin Yongyan suddenly glanced at Qin without a trace. He faintly felt that. Chapter 122. The next morning. Qin Xueqing didn't buy breakfast today, so Qin went to the roadside stall and bought some. This time he didn't buy steamed buns but jianbing fruits for the little fellow. The little fellow had been eating Cantonese morning snacks for 2 days. Qin thought that her appetite would be very picky, so he bought jianbing fruits just to let her have a taste. If she really didn't like it he would have to cook it himself. However, what Qin didn't expect was that the little fellow was instantly interested in the jianbing fruits after getting them. She held the oiled paper bag, opened her mouth wide and took a big bite. Her little face was immediately covered with a lot of sauce. The little fellow frowned and chewed hard. After chewing for a while she suddenly handed the jianbing fruits to Qin and laughed. Delicious. Papa, eat it. Because of the existence of the big cat, she had now developed a good habit of sharing with others all the time. Seeing this, Qin smiled and touched her head. He said softly, "Good girl, you are delicious. Don't get oil all over your body." Nodding, the little fellow took the jianbing fruits and fed them to the big cat. At this time, Qin turned to look at Qin Ruiying. Qin Ruiying just ate a few mouthfuls casually. Now she was sitting on the bed and cultivating again. It was not right to say that she was cultivating because she hadn't even entered the door. Now she was still at the stage of looking for qi. This was actually a very boring thing, but in order to keep up with Qin's pace she had to work hard. Qin saw it all in her eyes. He was obviously very anxious in his heart, but he had to act as if nothing had happened, which really made him a little uncomfortable. Qin checked Qin Ruoying's physical condition. She was very healthy and there was no problem. Except for the lack of qi, everything was perfect. If Qin Ruoying couldn't find qi, it was normal. In that case, it was unreasonable that Qin Xueqing couldn't find the sense of qi. She was a clasping Dan master after all, and her 5 senses were much better than normal people. She could even perfectly control her own body, down to her skin and internal organs. But even so, Qin Xueqing still couldn't feel the spiritual qi of heaven and earth. A dignified martial Dao grandmaster was actually inferior to a 4-year-old child. The more he thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. Qin was afraid that the truth would shock them, so he could only emphasize to them how difficult it was to find qi. As for Qin Yongyan, he could clearly see that there was something wrong with the two of them, so he simply hid in his room all day and silently cultivated. The morning passed quickly. Qin Ruoying, Qin Xueqing and Qin Yongyan basically wouldn't show up except for meal times. The little girl was very sensible. After hearing that her mother was studying, she did not disturb her mother. After lunch, Qin thought about it for a while and went out with the little fellow. Their destination was the largest Chinese medicine wholesale market in Shangjing. He had bought so many herbs in Zhonghai before, and he didn't expect to have to buy them again so soon. For his wife and sister-in-law, Qin was now going all out. So when he took the little fellow to the Chinese medicine market, he wasted millions again. Spirit Gathering Pill. It was an entry-level pill that could allow qi refining stage cultivators to quickly accumulate qi. Because of the lack of a few core ingredients, the effect of the pill might be greatly reduced like the simplified version of the Spirit Gathering Pill. Qin really didn't have a solution for their current situation, so he could only put all his hopes on the pill. Maybe after they ate the Spirit Gathering Pill, they would be able to sense the spiritual qi of heaven and earth after having true qi in their bodies. The idea was not bad and it was worth a try. So Qin waited until midnight. After the truck brought the herbs he needed, he immediately began to make the Spirit Gathering Pill in the yard. In order to improve the effect of the pill, Qin even directly poured true qi into it. Although it wasn't much, it should be able to slightly increase the effect of the pill. Alchemy was a very time-consuming thing, so when he finally finished making the Spirit Gathering Pill, Qin Ruoying had already fallen into a deep sleep. Looking at his wife's diligent appearance for the past 2 days, Qin couldn't help but be angry and anxious. He was very irritated, so he simply went to the yard and started to set up a formation. With the Qin family's courtyard as the foundation, he gathered all the spiritual qi around Zhonghai. Spirit Gathering, Qi Concealing, Defense, 3 formations in one. It could be considered as opening up an excellent place for them to cultivate. Frost and Snow Night, Cold Wind Blew. Dongming Alley was peaceful and tranquil, a stark contrast to the noisy Hohai bar. Qin stood alone on the roof of the main hall, looking at the cold crescent moon. His heart was filled with endless anxiety. No matter what, he had to let Ying step into the Aura's core stage. He stood there for an entire night. It wasn't until the sun rose from the east, and when a hazy glimmer appeared on the horizon, that Qin knocked on his sister-in-law's door. His sister-in-law was a master. She only needed to rest for 2 hours a day, so when Qin knocked on the door she had already started cultivating. Qin handed her a Spirit Gathering Pill. She didn't ask any questions, directly swallowed it, then returned to her room to continue cultivating. Qin, on the other hand, stood outside the door, silently sensing the movements in her room. There was still something wrong. Even though the Spirit Gathering Pill didn't have an immediate effect, but shouldn't there be some reaction? Why wasn't there any movement at all? Qin anxiously paced back and forth in the yard. After an unknown amount of time, the little fellow slowly woke up. Qin hurriedly ran to buy breakfast, then helped her get up and wash up. Qin Ruoying sat on the bed and looked at Qin who had finished her work. Suddenly she sighed softly. After all, he was the one who slept beside her. So no matter how well Qin hid it, Qin Ruoying still keenly sensed that something was wrong with him. But she didn't say anything. After a simple breakfast, she silently sat on the bed and continued cultivating. Qin fed her the Spirit Gathering Pill, indicating that she should relax, then went to find Qin Yongyan again. At this time, Qin Yongyan had already successfully cultivated a trace of true essence. Even though it was very small, it represented that he had become a true cultivator. Qin hesitated for a moment, but still handed the Spirit Gathering Pill to him. Hearing Qin say that it was helpful for cultivation, Qin Yongyan immediately swallowed it. The spirit-gathering pill melted in his mouth. Qin Yongyan was stunned for a moment, then hurriedly sat cross-legged. Qin stood next to him, silently sensing the changes in the spirit qi around him. 10 minutes later, Qin came to the courtyard. He looked at the west wing, then looked at the east wing. Then he turned around and looked at the main hall. The door of the main hall was wide open. From his position he could just see the large red sandalwood table carved with dragons. On top of the table was Li Bai's, gazing at the Heavenly Gate mountain. The Heavenly Gate is broken and the Chu River is opened. The blue water flows east. Suddenly, a murderous aura suddenly exploded from his body. A formless energy quickly spread out with him as the center. It was as if a stone had suddenly been dropped into a calm water surface, causing ripples to appear one after another. Crack. In the small courtyard, the blue stone slabs shattered. Following that, the ground beneath his feet suddenly sank nearly a foot deep. Qin looked up at the sky with a gloomy face. He finally knew why. Qin Ruiying, Qin Xueqing. Chapter 123. Sai Courtyard. The blue stone floor in the inner courtyard was completely shattered, and the ground strangely sank nearly a foot deep. Because it was covered by snow when the ground broke, it did not raise too much smoke and dust. Qin stood in the middle of the courtyard silently. This movement also alarmed the others in the courtyard. The little fellow was the first to run out. When she came out of the door, she saw the movement made by Qin. Wow! The scene in front of her completely shocked the little fellow. She opened her small mouth and opened her eyes wide, looking around curiously. The courtyard seemed to have been hit by a meteor. The closer to the center of the courtyard, the deeper the ground collapsed. The originally flat bluestone floor had been completely destroyed, and the collapse of the ground also caused a lot of soil to be turned up. It looked like the scene of a forced demolition. The little fellow stepped forward and carefully walked down the steps. He was very smart. She knew that the bluestone floor could not be stepped on, so she carefully stepped on the mud, and then by holding her hands flat to maintain her balance, she moved closer to Qin step by step. Because it was winter, the soil was frozen very tightly, so it became very slippery. If she was not careful, she would slip. The more she moved forward, the more difficult it was to move forward. The little fellow took only 2 steps forward, and suddenly she staggered and almost slipped. She waved her little hands and tried to maintain her balance, but after standing firm, she did not dare to move forward. Therefore she had to stand there honestly, pouting and shouting timidly, "Papa?" Her voice was very small, but it suddenly pulled Qin's thoughts back. Qin hurriedly turned her head to look, just in time to see the little girl's pitiful appearance, so she quickly came to her side and directly carried her up. Qin carried her back to the steps of the west wing, and the little fellow lay on his body, constantly looking back at the scene in the center of the courtyard. With her current experience, she obviously could not understand what was going on, so she could only ask with some doubts, "Papa, what's going on?" "Oh, it's nothing. It was a small earthquake just now." "What is an earthquake?" Qin choked on her question. After thinking about it, he held the little fellow and shook her up and down. Then he said with a smile, "This is an earthquake." Little rascal's head was shaking from his shaking, even more than when he was riding Big Cat. However, perhaps it was because of the experience of riding the Big Cat that the little guy did not seem to be afraid even under such violent shaking. Instead, he hugged Qin's head and shouted, "This is so fun." Hearing this, Qin hurriedly stopped what he was doing and then warned with a serious expression, "That's not right. Not fun at all. Earthquakes are very scary. When it happens, you have to hide in a safe place such as the kitchen, the corner of the bathroom, or under the table. Do you understand?" "Oh." Seeing the serious look on Qin's face, the little fellow immediately stopped laughing and nodded, pretending to be serious. After emphasizing the dangers of earthquakes to her, Qin put the little fellow down, and then told her that it was fine here and asked her to go play with the Big Cat. After all, the little girl was still young, so when she heard her father's words, she simply thought that it wasn't a big deal. Thus, she threw the scene in front of her to the back of her mind and ran back to the West Wing to continue watching cartoons. The 3 people of the Qin family had already heard the noise and came to the courtyard. After his daughter ran back to the house, Qin Ruiying walked to Qin's side, gently held his hand and asked worriedly, "What's wrong?" She did not speak but pulled her directly to the main hall. In the main hall, Qin Yongyan had been waiting for a long time. After Qin Xueqing also arrived, She looked at the Heavenly Gate mountain again, and then asked in a deep voice, "What is the Heavenly Gate?" Hearing this, Qin Yongyan's eyelids suddenly twitched and his expression became more serious. Qin Ruiying and Qin Xueqing looked at each other, and their faces were full of doubts. Heavenly Gate Xian knew she had never cared before. He returned from the Tianyuan world and returned to an environment with sparse spiritual energy like Earth. Even if all the masters in the world were gathered in front of him, a dignified soul formation cultivator, coming to such a degenerate planet, it would only be a matter of one move. It was like putting an MMA fighter in a nursing home or kindergarten. He could easily punch the Nanshan nursing home and kick the Beihai kindergarten. Therefore Shi had never cared about the inheritance on Earth. But now he found that he was wrong. He was ridiculously wrong. Qin Yongyan and Yanyan could cultivate. Qin Ruiying and Qin Xueqing couldn't cultivate. Qin Xueqing was even a martial Dao master of the same realm as Qin Yongyan. But why couldn't Qin Xueqing sense qi? Why? Shi didn't think in this direction before because he had lived for more than 500 years, and he had never heard of anyone who couldn't even sense qi. There were many cultivators who couldn't break through the qi refinement stage, and that was because their aptitude was too low. But if they couldn't even sense the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, wouldn't they be worse than those unintelligent wild beasts? This was obviously not a problem of aptitude. Qin Ruiying and Qin Xueqing were only cousins, not biological sisters. So there was only one thing left in common between them. And that was their identity as Xiannu. That mysterious heavenly gate could actually make people unable to sense the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Shi felt a little scared when he thought about it. So the most important thing now was to figure out what the so-called heavenly gate was. After Shi asked this question, the main hall suddenly fell into silence. After a long time, Qin Yongyan looked at Shi and sighed. The heavenly gate is an ancient legend. According to records, it hasn't appeared for more than 100 years. It hasn't appeared for more than 100 years? Then what exactly is it? The old people in the village said that the heavenly gate is the southern heavenly gate of the heavenly court. When the heavenly gate is opened, mortals can ascend and become immortals. What a joke. Hearing this, Shi couldn't help but angrily scold. It's the 21st century and there are satellites everywhere in the sky. People in the United States have even climbed to the moon. Why is this lousy village still practicing feudal superstition? It wasn't that Shi looked down on Earth, but it was the truth. In terms of the cultivation environment on Earth, Grand Uncle's pseudo-core state was probably the peak of the world. He hadn't even completely condensed his gene Dan, let alone yuanying. How could he want to ascend and become an immortal? This might be the biggest joke Shi had heard in more than 500 years. However, after hearing Shi's scolding, Qin Yongyan shook his head disapprovingly, but he didn't immediately reply. Shi was stunned for a moment and immediately realized that he had lost his composure. He didn't know what had happened to him recently. His hostility was getting stronger and stronger, and he was becoming more and more irritable. If there was something that didn't go his way, he would lose his composure. This situation seemed to have started after he came to Shangjing. Thinking of this, Shi couldn't help but take a deep breath. After adjusting his emotions, he looked at Qin Yongyan again. After seeing that he had calmed down a lot, Qin Yongyan replied seriously, "That's not a joke. It's true." Shi was stunned. He was really confused. Could it be that the cultivators on Earth thought that a Jindan was an immortal emperor? Not to mention what kind of realm an immortal emperor was. In terms of lifespan, an immortal emperor was said to be immortal as long as heaven and earth. How many years did a Jindan cultivator have? A mere 500 years. In the eyes of cultivators, 500 years was just a blink of an eye. It was nothing at all. Forget it, there might be a cognitive gap between him and Qin Yongyan. Chapter 124. What's a Xiannu? Qin Xueqing couldn't help but roll her eyes when she heard this question. Because she had already told Shi many times. Since her sister-in-law didn't want to answer, Qin Ruiying immediately explained, Xiannu is the witch who presides over the Elysium sacrificial ceremony. The sacrificial ceremony is held once a year, similar to the ancestral worship during the new year. What are the conditions? What are the requirements to become a Xian Nu? There are no special requirements. You have to be under the age of 10 and automatically step down when you reach the age of 30. No requirements. As long as you're of the right age? Qinshi pondered for a moment. Then, as if he had thought of something, he quickly asked, what happens after you're chosen? Do you have to go through any ceremony before you become a Xian Nu? Ceremony. Qin Ruiying thought for a moment, then said with some uncertainty, I can't remember clearly. I remember that on the day we became Xian Nu we entered the ancestral hall. After entering, the clan elder asked us to make a wish. He said that every Xian Nu can make a wish. Yes. Qin Xueqing also seemed to have thought of something at this time and immediately echoed, I remember that my wish at that time was to become a martial Dao master. And then, Qin Xueqing was a little distressed. After thinking for a long time she muttered, and then I forgot. Hearing this, Qinshi couldn't help but become serious. There was a problem. When they became Xian Nu, Qin Ruiying was 8 years old and Qin Xueqing was 6 years old. Children at this age should be able to clearly remember some of the more important things. How could she forget such a big thing as becoming the Empyrean maiden? Thinking of this, Qinshi couldn't help but turn his head to look at Qin Yongyan. Qin Yongyan seemed to know what he wanted to ask, so he directly answered, Xian Nu make wishes in the ancestral hall. I can't go in, so I don't know what ceremony to hold before becoming a Xian Nu. Qinshi frowned slightly. After hesitating for a moment, he then turned his head to Qin Ruiying and said very seriously, Ying, look at me and then do as I say. Okay. Qin Ruiying was a little confused, but out of her trust in Qinshi, she immediately nodded. Then at Qinshi's request she turned around and looked straight into Qinshi's eyes. Relax, take a deep breath, spit it out. Very good, Ying, look into my eyes. The soul-searching technique has certain side effects. Even if it is minimal, Qinshi can't use it on Qin Ruiying. Although he can't search her soul, he can try to hypnotize Qin Ruiying, and then use hypnosis to dig out the memories buried in her subconscious. Qinshi has never learned hypnosis, but he has seen the illusion of the Tianxian world, which is more advanced than hypnosis. Qin Ruiying is the person in the world who trusts him the most besides Nian Yan. So in less than 2 minutes, Qinshi has successfully hypnotized her. Ying, think about it. When you were 8 years old you became a Xian Nu, walked into the ancestral hall, made a wish, and then, what else did you do? The human consciousness has 2 basic functions, executive and supervisory. The executive function allows us to control and regulate our own behavior, and the supervisory function allows us to observe our own behavior. Under normal circumstances, these 2 functions of the consciousness are connected, but hypnosis can sever the connection between the 2 functions. Under hypnosis, the hypnotized person will enter a special state of consciousness. Their executive function will be normal, and they will be able to accept the hypnotist's orders, but the supervisory function will be lost. When the supervisory function is lost, the brain will enter a subconscious state and from there dig out some forgotten things. Qin Ruiying looked at Qinshi with empty eyes. After hearing Qinshi's question, the expression on her face immediately showed some pain. After thinking for a long time, Qin Ruiying murmured, after making the wish, I saw a door. The door was talking to me. It called me over. Qin Ruiying's words were too vague and Qinshi didn't understand. But his intuition told him that this is a very important part. The light disappeared, drank the soul-restoring soup, became a Xian Nu. Soul-restoring soup? Soul. Qinshi was shocked and then he stood up from the chair with an ashen face. He quickly formed a hand seal and then gently pressed his right hand on Qin Ruiying's head. Humans have 3 spiritual souls and 7 physical souls. After a person dies, the 7 physical souls will disperse, and then the heaven soul will ascend to heaven, the earth soul will enter the earth, and the life soul will enter the cycle of reincarnation. The heaven soul is yang, the earth soul is yin, and the life soul is yang. Therefore the earth soul is also called the yin soul. Qinshi's soul was damaged, so even though he was with Qin Ruiying every day he didn't realize it. Qin Ruiying's soul was damaged. The 7 physical souls are all there, but one of the 3 spiritual souls is missing. She lost her earth soul, so no wonder she couldn't find Qi. One of the 3 spiritual souls is missing, so she can't be considered a complete person. How can she embark on the orthodox path of immortality? At this thought, Qinshi immediately went to Qin Xueqing's side. He didn't say anything and directly placed his hand on Qin Xueqing's head. Qin Shueqing was stunned. Before she could react, Qin Shi had already retracted his hand and stood beside Qin Ruiying. He lightly brushed his hand across Qin Ruiying's face and then couldn't help but murmur, "No wonder you guys can't find Qi no matter what." So the price to become Xian Nu is to give up the earth soul. To mortals, missing one of the 3 spiritual souls was not a fatal problem. Missing 1 spiritual soul meant that the body was weak and sickly. Missing 2 spiritual souls meant that the body was in a coma. Missing 3 spiritual souls meant that the 7 physical souls would disperse and the person would die. The so-called soul recovery soup was probably a prescription to allow Xian Nu to live like a normal person. Without the earth soul, Xian Nu would never be able to become a necromancer. Even if she practiced martial arts, she would never be able to break through to the controlled Dan realm. As for cultivating, it was even more impossible. Qin Shi woke Qin Ruiying up. When she woke up, she immediately held her head as if she had a headache. Seeing this, Qin Shi gently rubbed her acupoints. When she finally felt better, Qin Shi said softly, "Ying, I have to go to the village again." Qin Ruiying was a little confused and didn't know what had happened. When she heard that Qin Shi was going to the village, she immediately asked nervously, "Go to the village? Why?" "It's nothing. Just rest well. Take good care of Nian Nian. Don't let her know that I'm gone. Don't worry, I'll definitely be back before the afternoon." Seeing Qin Shi's serious expression, Qin Ruiying could only nod and agree. She opened her mouth wanting to say something. But at this time, Qin Shi had already turned and walked out of the main hall. Qin Ruiying hurriedly got up and chased after him. But when she walked out of the main hall, Qin Shi had already soared into the sky, disappearing from her sight in the blink of an eye. Qin Ruiying stood outside the main hall, looking at the slightly gloomy sky. After a long time, she lowered her head and looked at the limestone fragments in the courtyard. A trace of worry flashed across her face. Why did he go? Chapter 125. Winter in the Qinling Mountains was very dark. It was clearly noon, but the visibility in the mountains was never more than 200 or 300 meters. The fog was thick and the snow was white. This small village hidden in the valley was as quiet and peaceful as ever. Outside the solemn ancestral hall, the huge bronze cauldron had been carefully cleaned. The accumulated snow on top of the cauldron had also been cleared away, revealing the thick and dignified aura of a bronze artifact that had been buried in snow for a long time. The originally empty square was now filled with countless ritual tools and props. Great-granduncle's body was nowhere to be found. According to the tradition of the village, after setting up a cenotaph for him, he still needed to be held in the square outside the ancestral hall for 7 days and 7 days before the burial ceremony could be held. The main character of this funeral was only great-granduncle. Third uncle was on the verge of death, but he was lucky enough to survive. Third uncle would probably secretly rejoice when he woke up. Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan hid in the house and drank to drown their sorrows. The sweet and bitter taste entered their throats, but the 2 of them wanted to get drunk. However, their cultivation was so high that even getting drunk had become an extravagant hope. Although several days had passed, the appearance of that young man seemed to be becoming clearer in their minds. Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan were the same age and 2 years older than Qin Yongyan. The village was not a sect, nor was it a family clan. This was an ordinary village with a few hundred families living in it. Of course, this village had its own special characteristics. The 100 schools of Qi Men and the 6 paths of miscellaneous studies. Each family might have a different inheritance. Zhao Xinghuai, Li Hoan, and Qin Yongyan all learned martial arts, so they had been very playful since they were young. As the backbone of the village, Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan had always had their own pride. Third uncle was their role model. Great-granduncle was their dream. But now everything had been shattered. Until that day they finally understood what was power. That was absolute power, and also a power that made people despair. Everyone was frightened. Even though the great-granduncle, who was the most senior, the strongest, and the most respected person in the village, died on the spot, no one dared to stand out and say that they would avenge him. The elders were silent. After great-granduncle died, the 7 elders didn't even dare to show their faces. They just let that man swagger away. Old Qin was incredible. She gave birth to a good daughter, and her daughter found a good son-in-law. Who would have thought that after competing with Qin Yongyan for most of their lives, They would lose in this aspect. The more Zhao Xinghai thought about it, the more frustrated he felt. He picked up the earthen jug and drank from it. Li Hoan was stunned for a moment, then he raised the earthen jar and clinked it with him. It was still snowing outside. After drinking this jar of wine, they had to go out and clear the snow to prevent the bronze cauldrons and magic tools in the square from being buried by the snow. After all, it was the great-granduncle's sacrificial offering. They couldn't be too shabby. Both of them were grandmasters of the dance stage, so after drinking, they casually put on a thin layer of clothing and walked out of the door. Then they took a broom and swept the snow on the ground. It was obviously noon, but because the fog blocked the sun, the whole sky looked very gloomy, as dreary as before a rainstorm. The gloomy weather made people feel even more gloomy. Bah, this damn weather. Zhao Xinghai cursed bitterly as he swept the snow with a broom. Suddenly, he seemed to feel something, so he quickly looked up at the sky. He saw that in the foggy sky, there suddenly appeared a faintly discernible black spot. The black spot was getting bigger and bigger. Zhao Xinghai couldn't help but straighten his body, looking up to see it more clearly. Old Li, look. Their eyesight was far better than ordinary people, so Li Hoan immediately found that very small black spot. It seemed to be a person. In just a breath's time, that black shadow had already flown directly above their heads. At this time the two finally saw the figure clearly. It was him. Even if this young man turned into ashes, he would be able to recognize him at a glance. Zhao Xinghai was shocked. Almost without thinking, he raised the broom and put on a defensive posture. However, the young man flying in the sky didn't seem to see them at all. They didn't see him do anything, but a long sword suddenly appeared in his hand. Oh no! As soon as he saw the sword, Zhao Xinghai panicked. But before he shouted, he saw the young man gently slashing the sword at the ancestral hall below. A sword gleam with golden light shot out. As the sword gleam flew toward the ancestral hall, it slowly became bigger. At first it looked like an ordinary long sword. In the blink of an eye, it had become dozens of times bigger. When it was about to reach the ancestral hall, the sword gleam seemed to have become a high-speed train, directly hitting the middle of the ancestral hall's door. Boom! The ancestral hall's door exploded with a loud bang, immediately setting off thousands of violent turbulence. The wooden door was swept by the violent turbulence, instantly smashed into countless pieces. However, it wasn't over yet. After hitting the ancestral hall's door, the sword gleam didn't stop. Like a train that didn't stop, the sword gleam passed through the front yard, crushed the main hall, and only stopped when it hit the hillside behind the ancestral hall. This young man's casual swing of the sword actually cut the ancestral hall in half. The sword gleam disappeared. The violent turbulence that it set off became even more violent. Zhao Xinghai stood in the square, holding his dantian and crossing his arms in front of him. The violent flying sand and gravel kept hitting his body, causing his skin and flesh to hurt. If he continued to resist like this, he might suffer unnecessary injuries. So Zhao Xinghai thought for a while and had no choice but to put down his pride as a grandmaster. He suddenly lay on the ground, then covered his head with both hands, and prayed that the storm would soon subside. After a long time, the turbulence finally calmed down and the smoke and dust dissipated. The solemn ancestral hall had been split into two, as if the middle part had been forcefully removed. It was a scene of broken walls and ruins. Zhao Xinghai lay on the ground. After feeling that the storm had subsided, he secretly raised his head to look at the situation. Li Hoan lay not far away from him. The open space around the square was full of broken wood and gravel, and the ancestral hall was also split in half. He hesitated for a moment, then raised his head to look at the sky. That young man, holding a long sword, he looked like a god descending from the heavens, looking down on all living beings with an expressionless face. He gently landed not far in front of Zhao Xinghai. Then his voice slowly reached Zhao Xinghai's ears. I don't want to kill for no reason, so I want to ask you to tell me, Xian Yu's ghost, where is it? These words were not directed at Zhao Xinghai alone. His voice was very soft, but it rang in every corner of the village at the same time. The tranquility of the village was broken. Countless people came out of their rooms and rushed toward the square. Looking from the sky, it was like a piece of white paper suddenly appeared with many ants. The crowd was crowded but no one dared to approach the square. She held a long sword, silently looking at the ancestral hall in front of him. Suddenly, a group of old men came out from the ruins of the ancestral hall. There were a total of 7 of them, all wearing white training clothes, and they were of different sizes. The leader was holding the dragon-headed walking stick of great-granduncle that day. He probably took over great-granduncle's position after his death. The 7 old men stood on the steps looking at Qinshi from afar. After hesitating for a moment, the leader of the old men sighed softly. "You are already a heavenly being at such a young age. Why do you have to force us old bones?" Hearing this, Qinshi could not help but sneer. "Hand over the Xianyin soul and I promise not to hurt anyone." As his voice fell, the leader of the old men fell silent. The few old men beside him could not help but have a slight change in expression. Immediately after, they silently communicated with their eyes. This ancient village hid many secrets. For example, Xian Nu's ghost was actually the key to opening the Divine Gate. The Divine Gate had not appeared for more than 100 years, and Xian Nu had been replaced by batches. It was not until this batch that they finally received a heavenly warning, confirming that the Divine Gate was about to open. This was also their last chance. Several old men looked at Qinshi at the bottom of the steps, silently communicating. Chapter 126. The wind and snow continued. The elders did not speak. They were communicating with their eyes. Perhaps it was their unique tacit understanding. Qinshi did not understand, nor did he bother to guess. He stood in the square with his sword in hand, quietly waiting for their reply. More and more people gathered around, but no one dared to approach the square. Zhao Xinghuai and Li Hoan had already retreated to the small house where they were drinking. The cold wind whistled past, and the square was a scene of desolation. After about 2 minutes, the elder with the dragon-headed cane finally turned his head and glanced at Qinshi. But then he shifted his gaze away. The expression on his face was very complicated, as if he was still struggling with something. In fact, on the day when Qinshi took away Qin Ruiying, they had already discussed it. At that time they chose to compromise. But what they did not expect was that Qinshi would actually come back and want to take back Xian Nu's ghost. Everyone handed the right to make the decision to him, which put a lot of pressure on him. After looking at the elders again, seeing that they all nodded at him, the elder frowned and finally made the final decision. "We agree to your request." Hearing this, Qinshi could not help but nod, very satisfied with his answer. The elder slowly walked down the stairs with the dragon-headed cane, then went straight to the giant bronze cauldron. "The ghosts of Xian Nu have been sealed in this giant cauldron for generations. I will now release them." After explaining to Qinshi, the elder suddenly jumped up and inserted the dragon-headed cane in his hand into the giant bronze cauldron. The sound of metal colliding was suddenly heard. Immediately after, a golden light suddenly emerged from the giant bronze cauldron. The golden light was as small as the light from a laser pointer at first. But in the blink of an eye, the light had become as thick as a bucket. The golden light burst into the sky. A crack was instantly torn in the gloomy sky. The clouds in the sky churned. As if affected by something, with the golden light as the center, a huge cloud vortex gradually condensed in the clouds. What was even stranger was that the cloud vortex was rotating at a speed visible to the naked eye. The old man standing beside the giant cauldron became excited when he saw the scene in front of him. Suddenly, a faint fluorescent golden barrier appeared above the village, instantly enveloping the entire valley. Then a strong vibration came from the ground as if there was an earthquake. Immediately afterward, a golden light pillar as thick as a bucket rose from the 4 corners of the valley. These 5 pillars of light seemed to be the pillars of the barrier. When the light pillars rose from the 4 corners, the barrier in the sky became even more dazzling. The barrier was like a golden tortoise shell, encircling the valley where the village was located. The wind and snow that filled the sky suddenly stopped. The sun broke through the clouds. Almost instantly, everyone felt their eyes light up and their vision widened a lot. Formation array? Seeing this, Qinshi couldn't help but frown. He still remembered that there was a stone tablet at the entrance of the village, with the word Fongxing written on it. So he turned his head to look at the entrance of the village, only to find that the stone tablet was located at the place where the light pillar rose. He originally thought that this village only had a simple concealment formation, but after it was activated, Qinshi found that this formation array was no small matter. There were only a few functions of the formation array: trapping, killing, illusory, and some non-offensive auxiliary formations, such as breath concealment and spirit gathering. This formation array was arranged according to the terrain of the dragon vein, and could be said to be very expensive. After the 5 light pillars rose, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the entire formation suddenly swept over like a tide, wave after wave. Qinshi hadn't felt this surging spiritual energy of heaven and earth for a long time. But it was a little strange. With the conditions of the earth, even if it was a spirit-seizing formation set up by a Dongshu stage cultivator, it was impossible to set off such a strong spiritual energy tide in such a short time. Qinshi thought for a while. Then he suddenly understood. The formation in front of him was not a spirit-seizing formation, but a composite formation with both spirit-gathering and spirit-binding functions at the same time. The formation used the valley as the base, the 4 stone tablets in the 4 directions as the formation door, the giant bronze cauldron in the center of the square as the formation eye, and the valley terrain as the formation pattern. After the formation was set up, it would continuously seize the spiritual energy of heaven and earth from the Qinling Mountains, and then bind the spiritual energy within the formation. To seize such a large amount of spiritual energy of heaven and earth from the earth, this formation array was set up at least 500 years ago. The spirit-binding formation was a one-time use formation. After it was activated, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth accumulated over the years would burst out at once. In the heavenly jade world, cultivators above the golden core stage would usually set up a spirit-binding formation in their cave abodes, in case of emergency. This was like rain from the sky. So Qinshi hurriedly sat cross-legged on the ground, taking advantage of the surging spiritual energy tide, and began to cultivate crazily. The opportunity couldn't be missed, so Qinshi didn't want to investigate why the old man suddenly activated this one-time auxiliary formation array. However, not long after he sat down cross-legged, the 4 light pillars in the north, south, east, and west suddenly turned into rainbows like a rainbow bridge, and suddenly connected with the main light pillar above the giant bronze cauldron. The 5 light pillars suddenly gathered together, and the main light pillar immediately became very thick. Just by looking at its diameter, it was almost the same as the giant bronze cauldron. At this moment, the old man standing below the giant cauldron's face suddenly changed, and a burst of ecstasy appeared on his face. Then he suddenly knelt on the ground and shouted respectfully, "Welcome, Divine General." Before he finished speaking, a figure walked out of the light pillar. It was a burly man who was almost 2 meters tall. His upper body was bare, revealing his strong muscles. The man called Divine General was floating in mid-air. After slowly scanning the surroundings, he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Heaven's opening line, you only have the time of an incense stick. Speak." The old man knelt on the ground and looked up at the Divine General in the sky very sincerely. It seemed that he was so excited that his lips moved for a long time, but he didn't say a word. The elder ancestor's words were true. At this moment, Qinshi suddenly opened his eyes. He looked at the man flying in the sky, then looked at the old man kneeling on the ground. Then Qinshi's lips suddenly curled into a faint sneer. "I thought you were really going to return Xian Nu's spirit to me. I didn't expect that you just wanted to ask for help. Forget it, since you don't want to give it to me, I'll find it myself." As he said that, he slowly stood up from the ground. After hearing Qinshi's words, the Divine General lowered his head and noticed him. One was in the sky. One was on the ground. Chapter 127. The spirit-binding array that had existed for hundreds of years was suddenly activated. Wave after wave of heaven and earth spirit qi surged, giving Qinshi an illusion. It was as if he had returned to the Tianxian domain. The surging heaven and earth spirit qi created an extremely comfortable environment for him, so comfortable that all the pores on his body could not help but open up naturally. He really needed the nourishment of heaven and earth spirit qi. Now every breath he took was a great pleasure for Qinshi. The spirit qi surged and the golden light soared into the sky. When the so-called Divine General walked out of the pillar of light, Qinshi finally understood the meaning of the existence of this array. This spirit-binding array was actually the last trump card of the village. The Divine General of the Elysium. The accumulation of hundreds of years of the array was only in exchange for the time it took for the divine general to appear. When Qin Shi killed great-granduncle and took Qin Ruoying away, they did not activate the array. Now that he came back to ask for the ghost, these old guys finally chose to activate the array and tried to fight to the death with Qin Shi. It could be seen that Xian Nu's ghost was more important to them than their own lives. Qin Shi looked up at the burly man flying in the sky. A long sword of frost suddenly appeared in his hand. The old guys at least had the chance to struggle and hesitate, but he did not. Because he was faced with only one choice. Take back Yingying's ghost. Otherwise, when Qin Ruoying gradually grew old in his arms, Qin Shi would also fall into endless pain and regret. He could not accept the arrival of that day. Therefore, then let's fight. If they were not willing to give, then let's fight. Qin Shi was determined to kill, and the long sword of frost immediately glowed faintly. Then, under the slightly surprised gaze of the divine general, he suddenly waved the long sword in his hand. The tip of the sword went from bottom to top, drawing an arc in the air. A sword radiance suddenly flew out. Seeing that Qin Shi dared to suddenly attack him, the divine general's eyes flashed with surprise. The sword radiance came menacingly, and in an instant, it was in front of him. He did not seem to move, but a ball of blazing flames suddenly sprang up around the divine general. A barrier of stellar energy that seemed to be made of flames instantly formed. Bang! The sword radiance slammed into the flame barrier, like a typhoon erupting, and a storm of chi soared into the sky. But right after that, the flame barrier suddenly expanded. Then a huge fireball with a diameter of more than 10 meters appeared in the air. Interesting. Accompanied by a burst of laughter, the divine general's figure suddenly flew out of the fireball. He suddenly stretched out his right hand and formed a claw with his 5 fingers. He clawed at the air and a golden fireball appeared in his palm. After the golden fireball appeared, the divine general's body seemed to be on fire. Golden flames kept jumping around him. Like the sun rising from the east, the golden fireball instantly ignited all the air within a radius of dozens of meters. The sun hung in the sky, the fire burning the sky. Qin Shi stared intently at the tall and sturdy man in the sky, a trace of excitement rising in her heart. This move made him feel a hint of danger. The divine general seemed to be holding the sun in his hand, his body burning with raging flames. Like a meteor falling from the sky, he cut across the sky and smashed viciously toward Qin Shi, who was standing on the ground. At this critical moment, Qin Shi swung the sword in his hand, and in an instant, tens of thousands of sword radiances appeared. Countless long swords made of frost and snow appeared around him. They floated in the air, quietly waiting for orders. Qin Shi pointed his sword to the sky, and the floating swords immediately turned their tips and aimed at the fireball in the sky. The third move of the moonlight sword technique. 10,000 swords returned to the sect. The densely packed long swords of frost and snow instantly converged into a long river of sword radiances, like the Milky Way flowing in reverse, and collided with the fireball in midair. The entire sky was instantly divided into 2 worlds. On one side of the divine general of the stellar of time, flames and snakes of fire danced in the sky. It was as if one was above the sun, the crown flow feathers shining brightly. On the other side of Qin Shi, wind and clouds surged, snow and ice splattered everywhere, as if one was caught in the most violent snowstorm of the North Pole. The two of them seemed to be separated by an invisible and boundless glass wall. In one world there were 2 kinds of wonders. It was truly amazing. Boom. The moment the sword radiances met the fireball, it was as if a nuclear bomb had exploded. A strong shockwave suddenly erupted, and the old man closest to them was immediately sent flying by the violent strength chi. Such a violent shockwave instantly turned all the houses around the square into ruins. Fortunately, most of the people in the village were not ordinary people, and those who dared to come close to watch the battle were experts of a certain level of strength. But even so, the aftermath of the battle still caused them serious internal injuries. It was too terrifying. Just the aftermath of the battle between the two of them could cause such a huge amount of damage. Was he still human? Zhao Xinghuai lay on the ground, trembling. Suddenly he came to his senses and quickly stood up, clutching his chest in pain. Then he pulled Li Hoan up, turned around and shouted to the crowd behind him, "Everyone run! Leave the village. The farther the better." The crowd of onlookers fled in all directions. A battle of this level was no longer something they could watch. On the square, the shock wave caused by the battle between the two of them finally subsided. The square, which was originally the size of 2 basketball courts, seemed to have been hit by a huge invisible iron ball. With Qin-Shi as the center, a huge circular crater appeared on the ground of the square. The deepest part of the crater was at least 5 meters deep. Qin-Shi floated in the middle of the crater, facing the divine general of the stellar of time in the sky. After this collision, they had more or less figured out each other's strength, so they did not intend to attack immediately. The divine general looked at Qin-Shi thoughtfully, then suddenly laughed. Your cultivation is not very high, but the move you used just now was really powerful. From the looks of it, he seemed to be very interested in the sword art that Qin-Shi had just used. Is that so? Qin-Shi raised her eyelids and looked at the tall and sturdy man. She couldn't help but sneer. The divine general in front of him was not an immortal cultivator, but after exchanging blows with him, Qin-Shi could roughly estimate his strength. Above Yuanying and below soul formation. What about himself? In fact, he was now like a sorcerer without mana. He still had his realm, but his accumulation of vital energy was far from enough. When the array was activated just now, Qin-Shi took the opportunity to absorb a wave of spiritual energy from heaven and earth, which allowed him to successfully use the third move of the Moonlight Sword technique. 10,000 swords returned to origin. Qin-Shi floated above the crater, holding the long sword silently as if he was thinking about something. The divine general did not seem to be in a hurry, because the person in front of him had indeed piqued his interest. After a while. Chapter 128. Wasting time? He was probably stalling for time. After hearing the elder's words, the immortal general lowered his head and looked at Qin-Shi with a faint smile. He thought for a moment and suddenly spread his hands. Following that, 2 golden fireballs leaped up from his palms. I'm very interested in the sword technique you used just now. If you give it to me, I promise I won't attack again. He was very interested in Qin-Shi's sword technique. The expressions of the few old men who were hiding nearby changed drastically when they heard his words. If the immortal general didn't attack, then after he left, that young man would probably massacre the entire village. If they had known this would happen, they would have just returned the Yin soul to him. Qin-Shi held his sword and floated above the giant pit. He lowered his head and didn't say a word. No one knew what he was thinking. After hearing the immortal general's words, Qin-Shi looked up at him. It seemed that he didn't like the feeling of looking up at others. So Qin-Shi flew up until he reached the same height as the immortal general. Then he said calmly, "You want my sword technique? You have good taste." The Moonlight Sword technique was comparable to the 49 forms of heaven's divination. There were only 3 forms, but the power of these 3 forms would increase as the user's realm increased. Gold will always shine. Your cultivation isn't high enough, so you won't be able to use the true power of this sword technique. Why don't you give it to me? What do you think? The immortal general smiled. As he spoke, he looked at the 2 golden fireballs in his palms. The golden fireballs kept jumping as if they were silently threatening him. I might not be able to kill you in 30 minutes, but I don't think it'll be a big problem if I want to seriously injure you. The immortal general was very confident, as if he had Qin-Shi under control. Hearing this, Qin-Shi couldn't help but laugh. This sword technique is called the Moonlight Sword technique. It's of the Yin attribute. It might conflict with your fire attribute technique. That's not important. No one will complain about having too many techniques. The immortal general said indifferently. However, Qin-Shi's next words stunned him. I have a set of saber techniques that are comparable to a sword technique. It's of the Yang attribute. I think it'll be compatible with your technique. As soon as he finished speaking, Qin-Shi gently raised his left hand. Then a gust of wind suddenly blew in the deep pit below him. A small tornado suddenly rose from the bottom of the pit. Then it wrapped the dust and gravel on the ground and flew directly toward Qin-Shi's left hand. In the blink of an eye, a long saber made of dust suddenly appeared in his hand. After the dust blade was formed, it immediately formed a sharp contrast with the frost sword in his right hand. The saber was yellow, but the sword was clear and bright. Dust was the knife, frost and snow were the sword. He wanted to kill everyone in the world. The immortal general was stunned for a moment. Then he suddenly laughed wildly. Saber and sword mastery? Interesting. Then let me see if your saber is worthy of your sword. With that, the divine general clasped his hands together. The two sun-like blazing fireballs immediately merged into one, erupting with a powerful shockwave. An incomparably dazzling golden light suddenly exploded from his palm, illuminating the entire sky in a deathly white. The extreme of yang fire burning the sky and boiling the sea. While the immortal general was practicing, Qin was not idle. The frost sword in his right hand suddenly glowed with a faint cold light, and the dust blade in his left hand shone with a little yellow light. Moonlight sword technique, red sun saber technique. The saber and the sword merged. The saber cut the wind, the sword cut the clouds, and the wind and clouds were disturbed. As soon as this move was made, the world suddenly changed color. There seemed to be a wave of saber and sword behind Qin. The invisible wind and visible clouds in the sky strangely disappeared at the moment when the saber and sword came out together. The saber and sword were annihilated and the wind and clouds changed color. With Qin as the center, there seemed to be a vacuum zone within 100 feet. All the wind, clouds, dust, and even the spiritual qi of heaven and earth were expelled from the battlefield by him. Then he slashed the saber and sword in his hand toward the immortal general. In the courtyard. After watching an episode of cartoons, the little fellow sat on the bed and shouted, "Papa? Papa, I want to pee." She was very clingy. She knew how to go to the bathroom by herself, but she just didn't want to go alone. The little fellow shouted for a while. Her father, who used to respond to her calls, didn't come today. She pouted and was obviously a little unhappy, so she immediately lay on the bed and rolled. "Papa, Papa, Papa, where did you go?" After all, Qin was just a mortal, so she didn't have the 5 senses as sharp as Qin. She was still standing in the yard in a daze. Although Qin could even kill great-granduncle with one sword, Qin had a faint unjustified worry after he left this time. She hadn't seen Qin for 5 years and she was really afraid to be separated from him again. Papa was not here and Mama didn't hear it. When the big cat saw that the little one was making a scene, it immediately jumped out of the bed and ran to Qin side. Then it rubbed its body against her feet. Meow. The big cat called Qin back from her chaotic thoughts. As soon as she saw the big cat, she knew that something must have happened to Yan, so she ran to the west wing. Sure enough, before she stepped into the room, she had already heard the little fellow shouting for Papa. Children were always clingy, so sometimes when their mother was not around, they would start to look for their mother inexplicably when they went to the bathroom or went out to throw away the garbage. Once their mother didn't appear in time, then sorry. If it was light, they would be easily angry, and if it was heavy, they would cry, and it was very difficult to coax them. Qin still spent too little time with the little fellow, so once the little fellow had anything, the first reaction was to look for her father, not her mother. She quickly sat beside the little fellow, gently helped her up, and then asked worriedly, "Yan, what's wrong?" "I want to pee." The little fellow pouted and said very discontentedly, "Then Mama will take you, okay?" As she said, Qin reached out to pick up the little fellow. However, the little fellow pushed her away. "No, I want Papa. I want Papa." As she said, the little fellow suddenly pouted and cried. "I want Papa." The more she said, the more upset she became, and bean-sized tears suddenly fell from the corners of her eyes. Qin was a little at a loss and could only softly comfort her. "Papa went out to buy something and will be back soon. If you want to pee, Mama will go with you, okay?" "No, I want Papa." The little fellow sat on the bed, her little hands kept patting the bed and her 2 legs kicked the bed at random. Looking at her like this, she was on the verge of exploding. Seeing her like this, Qin suddenly looked a little embarrassed. After hesitating for a moment, she tentatively reached out her hand again. The little fellow did not refuse, and Qin finally took her in her arms. Yan, Papa went out to buy something and he will be back soon. Yan, don't cry. Mama will be with you, okay?" "No. Papa said that he will never leave me. I want Papa. I want Papa." Hearing this, Qin trembled all over and could not help but cry. At this moment she suddenly remembered the time when Yan was just born. At that time the little fellow was still a cute baby. As long as she was not held for a while, she would cry loudly. Whenever little Yan cried, Qin would hold her in her arms in a panic. Shaking and shaking, it would take a long time for little Yan to stop crying and giggle. So what she was most afraid of at that time was that the little fellow would cry. Time flew and the child had grown so big. Chapter 129. Qin Ruiying held the little girl in her arms. All of a sudden she seemed to realize something. When she left Nian was still young, so she had no impression of her. Although Qin came back later, he had been with the little girl since he came back. With his meticulous care and love, Qin succeeded in occupying more and more weight in the little girl's heart. He had surpassed her mother and Aunt Zhang. Therefore the little girl only needed her father now. Her father was her whole world. The intimacy between the father and daughter at any time made Qin Ruiying feel very lost. Father, mother, child. They were supposed to be a close family of 3. But because of the short separation before, there was a faint sense of alienation between them. The reason why Qin Ruiying felt alienated from Nian was that she hadn't realized how she should integrate into the family. Because of Nian's birth, the simple 2-person world between her and Qin she had completely turned into a brand new 3-person world. As the father and mother, they had never appeared by the little girl's side at the same time. With the reunion of the family, when Qin showed great strength and confidence, Qin Ruiying was lost. It was a feeling that could make any woman lose herself. At the same time it was also called a sense of security. Therefore she felt extremely worried when Qin just left for a while. Just like Nian, she had to look for her father when she went to the toilet. Compared to her daughter, how much better was she? The mother and daughter were too dependent on Qin. He was the perfect husband and the perfect father. She, on the other hand, was just an unqualified mother. Thinking of this, Qin Ruiying suddenly stopped crying. After wiping her eyes without leaving a trace, she let go of the little girl and carefully wiped her tears. Nian, don't cry. Daddy didn't leave you. He just went to buy groceries. He'll be back soon to cook for you. Don't you like Daddy's cooking the most? What do you want to eat tonight? I don't want to eat, I want Daddy. The little guy kicked the bed, still throwing a tantrum. Qin Ruiying had no choice but to hug her gently and keep trying to reason with her. After a long while, after the little girl calmed down a little, Qin Ruiying immediately picked her up and carried her to the bathroom. Let's go. Don't you want to pee? Mama will take you there. Be careful not to wet the bed again. Hearing this, the little guy was like a cat whose tail had been stepped on. He immediately pouted and shouted softly, I don't wet the bed. In the past life and in this life the two looked at each other, the sword and the sword were used to cut off their worries. I walk alone in the heavens and under the earth. I am duty-bound and crazy for love. This set of sword and saber techniques didn't originate from the heavenly Yen divine sect. Instead, it was an ancient inheritance that Qin obtained by chance. The Dark Heaven Evil Emperor. The third form of the saber, the third form of the sword. The third form of sword and saber. 3 by 3 is inexhaustible, 9 by 9 returns to 1. The saber cut the wind, the sword cut the clouds, and the wind and clouds were disturbed. Although it was a divine skill, it didn't change the fact that Qin cultivation had been damaged. Qin, who was seriously injured, faced the divine general who was in his peak state. The divine general held the golden crow in his hand. It was like the sun had descended to earth. Thousands of golden pillars of fire swore to burn everything in the world to ashes. Qin's face was as calm as water. After the sword and saber slashed out, 2 huge shadows appeared in the sky. A saber and a sword instantly collided with the scorching fireball. When the saber and sword shadows collided with the raging flames in the sky, the entire world shook. The shockwave that shot out in all directions instantly dimmed the 5 golden pillars. The huge cloud vortex in the sky also trembled, almost being torn apart by the violent strength qi and vanishing into thin air. The spirit binding array was on the verge of collapse. A few elders hid behind the hill behind the ancestral hall. After the wind and smoke dissipated, they cautiously poked their heads out. The scene in front of them completely stunned them. Annihilation. Everything was annihilated. This village with a long history was instantly razed to the ground by such a violent collision. When the smoke and dust dissipated, a huge circular crater with a diameter of hundreds of meters appeared below the 2 of them. The land was originally flat, the houses were neat, and there were fertile fields, beautiful ponds, mulberry trees, and other plants. It was a paradise where chickens and dogs could hear each other. Now it was completely gone. Even the small hill that they were hiding in had been cut in half. The divine general was still floating in the air. He wasn't wearing a shirt, revealing his strong muscles. The flames that kept rising around him like flames had already disappeared. Chi. There were no scars on his bronze-colored skin. But then the divine general was like a broken shower head. Tiny flowers of blood splattered all over his body. Not long after, his entire body was dyed red with blood. She held the saber in his left hand and the sword in his right as if he had never moved. But if one looked closely, they would find that Shi was in a very strange state. His eyes were empty as if he had lost his soul. The saber and sword were still in his hands, but there was a faint blood-red light around him. The confidence and wild laughter on the divine general's face had disappeared, leaving only fear. He was scared. Because his injuries were too serious, he couldn't even maintain flying. So the divine general immediately made a wise decision. Run. However, the moment he turned around, the blood-red light behind him lit up. The blood-red light that was as delicate and beautiful as fresh blood instantly dyed the entire sky red. The pillar of light that pierced through the clouds disappeared. The cloud vortex dissipated. The tortoise-shell-like golden barrier slowly turned into white smoke and disappeared. The wind and snow were still in the sky. The cold wind whistled through the sky with snowflakes. It was as if summer had turned to winter in an instant. A blood-red sword light suddenly slashed out. Bang! The hillside where the elders were hiding was immediately razed to the ground. Where is the soul of Xian Nu? The cold and emotionless voice suddenly sounded in the sky. Hearing this, the leading old man immediately knelt on the ground and kowtowed heavily. Then he tremblingly took out a black box and shouted, "The soul of the mysterious fairy is here. If I may be so bold, please spare our lives, immortal master." He knelt on the ground and held the box tightly with both hands as if he was begging for mercy. This box was their only chance to live. If that man didn't agree, then they could only destroy this box. They would fight to the death. However, just as the old man was about to say something, a long sword of frost and snow suddenly formed in the sky above his head. Then a blood-red sword light suddenly fell. Thud! The box fell to the ground and rolled a few times before lying down quietly in the mud. Shi casually waved his hand. The box seemed to have sensed something. After trembling slightly, it suddenly flew into his hand. After getting the box, Shi glanced around indifferently. The village had been reduced to nothing. The villagers had also retreated to the edge of the array. Everyone huddled together and trembled as they looked at the godlike man in the sky. He thought for a moment, then turned around and flew in the direction he came from. However, the moment he turned around and flew away, 6 blood-red sword lights suddenly appeared in the sky. Chapter 130. In the courtyard. Qin Ruiying took the little fellow to the bathroom and wiped her face with a hot towel. The little fellow stopped crying at this time. She stood on the ground with her mouth pursed and her face full of grievance, but she looked very cute. Because she had just washed her face, the little fellow's little face was red. Like a ripe red apple, Qin Ruiying could not help but reach out and gently pinch her pink little face. "I want to pee." As if to show her independence, the little fellow quickly ran to the side of the toilet and sat on it by herself. It was the first time Qin Ruiying saw her daughter go to the bathroom, and she could not help but feel a little strange. However, she was worried that the little fellow would fall, so she quickly walked over and gently held her. After going to the bathroom, the little fellow did not want Qin Ruiying to hold her and ran out without washing her hands. Qin Ruiying quickly followed behind her and found that she wanted to open the door and go out, so she quickly stopped her and asked nervously, "Nian Nian, where are you going?" She was afraid that the little fellow would run out to find her father. However, the little fellow did not seem to have that idea but pouted and replied, "Papa said that after watching an episode of cartoons we should go out and exercise. I want to exercise." Hearing this, Qin Ruiying could only smile bitterly and open the door for her. This child, 3 sentences without leaving her father's side, did not consider her mother's feelings. A gust of cold wind suddenly blew in when the door opened. The little fellow shivered but did not shrink back. Instead she shouted loudly, big cat, let's go play in the yard." Meow. The big cat lay at the foot of the bed, seemingly unwilling to move. Seeing this, the little fellow was immediately unhappy. She quickly ran to the side of the bed and pressed down on the big cat. Then she took it into her arms and carried it out of the west wing. Papa said that you have to play with me. Meow. Although the big cat was a monster, it still had the nature of an animal, so when winter came it was lazy and did not want to move much. However, since the little fellow said so, it had to obediently accompany her. The inner courtyard had been completely destroyed by Qinshi and there was a big hole in the middle. Qin Ruiying was afraid that she would run into the hole and fall, so she quickly said, Nian, just play on the steps. What do you want to play? Mommy can play with you. The little fellow put the big cat and seemed to think that there was no way to play in the yard, so she could not help but wrinkle her little face as if she was thinking about what she should play. Seeing this, Qin Ruiying immediately racked her brains to think of something. What to play? She had to say, as a mother's therefore it was best to take this opportunity to cultivate a good relationship with the little fellow. Qin Ruiying thought for a while, and then suddenly came up with a wonderful idea, so she immediately said to the little fellow, Nian, Mommy will play hide-and-seek with you, how about it? Hide-and-seek? The little fellow was stunned for a moment and then jumped up happily. She was so happy that she clapped her hands and shouted, Okay. I want to play hide-and-seek. She had been yearning for hide-and-seek for a long time. It was just that she used to live in the Kangju district and that house was too small so she could not play. Aunt Zhang did not like her to run around in the district, so she had never allowed her to play hide-and-seek with other children. Therefore, when Qin Ruiying proposed this idea, the little fellow was immediately excited. The courtyard was so big and there were so many rooms. It was perfect for playing hide-and-seek. The mother and daughter quickly reached a consensus. Qin Ruiying found and the little fellow hid. After the discussion, Qin Ruiying leaned against the wall and loudly chanted the 30-second countdown. Hearing her countdown, the little fellow, who was still giggling, immediately panicked. She looked around for a while, then suddenly jumped into the west wing and then hurriedly hid in the closet. The west wing was the place she was most familiar with, so her first reaction was to go back to the room. This was the first time she played hide-and-seek, so she did not have much experience, so she made a lot of noise. After Qin Ruiying finished counting down, she walked into the room with a faint smile. After looking around, she knew that the little fellow must have hidden in the closet. Nian, where did you hide? Mommy can't find you, she pretended to wander around the room. The little fellow covered her mouth with both hands and nervously hid in the closet. She didn't even dare to breathe. Qin Ruiying counted the time. About 2 minutes later she approached the wardrobe as she spoke. Because she was afraid of scaring the little fellow, she paused outside the closet for a while, and then slowly opened the closet door. Found you. Mommy, you're amazing. Seeing Qin Ruiying open the wardrobe door, the little girl didn't hide anymore. She immediately jumped into Qin Ruiying's arms and giggled. How is it? Is it fun? It's fun. I want to play more. Well, I'll give you another chance. This time you have to hide better, okay? The little guy nodded his head heavily. Looking at her excited little face, she had probably long forgotten about her father. If you want to get along with children happily, you have to have 3 hearts. Patience, love, and consideration. What's more, Nian was Qin Ruiying's favorite. Therefore, after she adjusted her state of mind, she immediately played with the little fellow. With her mother's company, time passed quickly. When Qin Ruiying found the little fellow for the 5th time, Qinshi finally came back. Like a gust of wind, he appeared in the courtyard without a sound. Qin Ruiying followed the little fellow. As soon as she walked out of the room, she saw Qinshi. She froze for a moment. But the little fellow had already rushed to Qinshi, shouting, Papa! Qinshi was afraid that she would slip, so he quickly stepped forward and picked her up. What's wrong? What are you playing? Hide-and-seek. Mommy, play hide-and-seek with me. Is it fun? It's fun. Qin Ruiying looked at Qinshi in a daze. Qinshi was playing with the little fellow in his arms as if there was nothing strange. What else did he want to hide? But could he hide it? Perhaps seeing the worry in Qin Ruiying's eyes, Qinshi put the little fellow down with a smile, then touched her head and said with a smile, Nian, it's cold outside. Go back to the room first. Seeing that her father was back, the little fellow was relieved, so she ran back to the room happily. After the little fellow left, Qin Ruiying finally couldn't help but grab Qinshi's arm and ask anxiously, Are you hurt? Where is the injury? Is it serious? As she spoke, she looked up and down at Qinshi nervously. She had no trace of injury. However, his face was devoid of any color and his lips were deathly pale. He looked like a patient who had lost too much blood. "I'm fine, don't worry." Chapter 131. She handed the box to Qin Ruoying as if she was presenting a treasure. She thought that Qin Ruoying would be very happy, but she didn't expect that after seeing the box, Qin Ruoying had a complicated expression on her face. She didn't understand, so he asked in confusion, "Ying, what's wrong? Are you unhappy?" Qin Ruoying didn't say anything, but her expression was also complicated. She thought she didn't understand the importance of this, so he explained, "The reason you can't sense qi is because when you became Xian Nu, they extracted your earthly soul. A person has 3 spiritual and 7 physical souls. Without one spiritual soul, you can't be considered a complete person. It's because of this that you can't cultivate." Before she could finish, Qin Ruoying suddenly interrupted him. "I can choose not to cultivate." With that, Qin Ruoying hurriedly took She's hand and sighed softly, "Do you know what my wish was when I was 8 years old?" "The wish you made when you became Xian Nu?" "Yes, Xian Nu can make a wish. I didn't have the same ambition as Yuan Qing back then, so my wish was very simple. I only wanted to live a peaceful and happy life like a normal person." When she said this, she suddenly understood something. He looked at Qin Ruoying's serious expression and couldn't help but gently pull her into his arms. Then he said solemnly to her, "I'm sorry, Ying, I made you worry." She hadn't been injured in the battle with the Divine General. However, he had paid a heavy price because of this. Because he had burned another drop of essence blood. Essence blood, the essence of blood, was also the life source of a cultivator. Essence blood contained enormous energy. Many demonic and evil techniques even relied on stealing the essence blood of others to increase their own cultivation. She used a secret technique to burn his essence blood, allowing himself to explode with power close to his peak for a short period of time. This allowed him to successfully kill the Divine General, who was comparable to a complete Yuanying. Essence blood wasn't present at birth, but gradually condensed as a cultivator's cultivation grew. After 500 years of accumulation, she had actually only accumulated 3 drops of essence blood. Before returning to Earth, he had already burned a drop because he didn't have enough vital essence. The Divine General had burned another drop. Therefore, he only had 1 drop of essence blood left. If he lost even this drop of essence blood, she wouldn't be far from death. Regret? Absolutely not. Even if I die, my heart won't be covered in dust. Qin Ruoying looked at She's slightly pale face and couldn't help but reach out to touch it. After feeling the warmth from his face, Qin Ruoying couldn't help but murmur, "Maybe it's because of Xian Nu's identity that I've basically fulfilled all the wishes I've made before. Just think of it as greed, so I have a new wish." Speaking of this, Qin Ruoying suddenly laughed, then turned to look at the room. At this time, the little girl's giggles sounded in the room. "Silly child, watching cartoons alone can make you convulse with laughter." After the Earth Soul returned to its original position, Qin Xueqing really found the sense of qi. That kind of mysterious feeling made her, a martial arts fanatic, immediately intoxicated. Faintly, she even had an illusion. The long-sealed gate of the Alcade state seemed to finally show a sign of loosening. She could finally step into the Alcade state. Qin Wanqing was still struggling to break through to the Alcade realm. Qin Yongyan, on the other hand, started cultivating a few days earlier than her and took the spirit-gathering pill. Therefore, he smoothly stepped into the early stage of qi refinement and directly stepped into the Alcade realm. He was now a grandmaster of the Alcade state. This also made him more convinced that what Qin taught them was much more powerful than martial arts. His father-in-law and sister-in-law were both obsessed with cultivation, so they didn't even come out for dinner. Qin didn't want to interrupt this kind of state where they forgot to eat and sleep, so he left some food in the refrigerator for them. After dinner, Qin wanted Qin Ruoying to also cultivate. But at this time, Qin Ruoying shook her head and proposed to take a walk in Hohai. Take a walk. The little girl was lying on the bed. After hearing her mother's suggestion, she immediately raised her hands and feet, expressing her absolute approval. Being cooped up at home every day, this little girl was about to become moldy. In winter, the sun set early. It wasn't even 7 o'clock in the evening, but some places without street lights were already pitch black. Outside the big house, One could see the old street light at the entrance of Dongming Alley. The light of the street light was slightly yellow, elongating the shadows of the family of three. The little girl held Qin Ruiying's left hand and Qin Shi's right hand. She squatted on the snow and her two small cotton boots seemed to have turned into skis, constantly yelling for them to run. Just like the sleigh pulling the carriage at Christmas, her parents were the elk pulling the carriage. And she was Santa Claus bringing joy to the mortal world. Since their daughter had this request, her parents had to agree even if they had to work like cows or horses. Thus, Qin Ruiying and Qin Shi looked at each other and smiled, and immediately pulled her to a trot. Giddy up. Horse run. Horse run. The sleigh started running and the little girl's 2 feet immediately pulled a long track on the ground. She was so happy that she giggled, feeling that it seemed to be more interesting than riding a big cat. Qin Ruiying's physical fitness was average. In winter she wore a lot of clothes and the snow was difficult to walk on, so after running for a while she was tired and panting. And because she was so happy she kept laughing. The intense exercise and the stimulation of the cold air immediately caused a sharp pain in her abdomen. Exercise-induced abdominal pain. Ouch. Qin Ruiying gasped for air as she clutched her stomach and groaned. Seeing this, Qin Shi quickly stopped. Qin Shi used his true essence to help her recuperate. After seeing that she was better, Qin Shi said to the little girl, "Mommy's body isn't good. Yan Yan, come, Daddy will play with you. Today I'll let you experience what it means to be fast and furious." After Qin Ruiying stopped, the little girl sat down on the ground. Hearing Qin Shi's words, she immediately stretched out her hands and took Qin Shi's right hand. "Little princess, let's go." After that, Qin Shi started running. In this kind of snow they couldn't run too fast. If the little girl couldn't control herself, she would be dragged to the ground by Qin Shi. Therefore, Qin Shi could only pay attention to the little girl's state while slowly speeding up. In fact, the speed was not very fast, but the little girl was very excited. She happily giggled and said, "Papa, come on. Papa, come on." It was really much more fun than riding a big cat. Hohai had not completely frozen and the skating rink had not been opened, so now Shikahai looked a little deserted. The weather was still too cold, so the family of three returned home after a round. In the evening, after the little girl fell asleep, Qin Ruiying finally began to cultivate. She had figured it out. If she neglected her daughter because of cultivation, then she was not worthy of being Yan Yan's mother. In a dark room, the little girl fell asleep sweetly, while Qin Shi and Qin Ruiying sat cross-legged on her left and right. Suddenly, Qin Shi opened his eyes. Chapter 132. Outside the house, the cold wind was whistling. The big pit that Qin Shi had stepped on had been covered with a shallow layer of snow. The blue stone floor was broken into pieces, protruding in the east and concave in the west. There were thousands of gullies, and if one was not careful one would slide down. Seeing that the little fellow's activity area was suddenly missing such a large area because of him, Qin Shi thought that he should find someone to repair it tomorrow, so that the little fellow could continue to gallop in the yard. Perhaps he could also buy her a set of children's outdoor expansion equipment. Just like the large-scale expansion equipment in the shopping mall, there were tire arrays, rock climbing, balance boards, ring bridges, scaling ladders, and so on. It was very playable and could also be used to train the little fellow's balance, athletic ability, coordination ability, and many other aspects. Qin Shi did not consider letting the little fellow cultivate for the time being. That was because Yan Yan still had to go to school in the future. At that time she would definitely play with other children in school. If she lost control a little and slapped other children, it would be troublesome. Therefore, it would not be too late to teach her cultivation when she was a little more sensible. While thinking, Qin Shi flew out of the yard. He wanted to go out and find another place to cultivate. Although the spiritual energy of heaven and earth near Shikahai was very rich, now his wife, sister-in-law, and father-in-law were all cultivating here. The cultivation of the three of them was still shallow, so it didn't matter if they were crowded together. However, Qin Shi's cultivation was too high, so he must not stay with them. Because once he started cultivating, he would immediately form a spiritual energy black hole in the courtyard, sucking all the spiritual energy of heaven and earth nearby into his body. How could others cultivate like this? Therefore, Qin Shi could only come out and find another place. Since returning to earth, Qin Shi had never deliberately wanted to cultivate. The reason why he changed his mind now was that after the battle with the divine general he suddenly had a sense of crisis. If he began to wholeheartedly restore his cultivation after returning to Earth, why would he waste a drop of blood essence today? Strength was the basic guarantee of a happy life. In order to make his happy life last longer, Qin decided to start cultivating seriously. In the past he had nothing to live for, but now he was full of happiness, so his fighting spirit was high. If he wanted to cultivate, he had to first find a suitable blessed enclave. Blessed enclaves were usually located in places where there were very few people. For example, in the mountains and on the islands, it was very easy for blessed lands to appear. The so-called blessed enclave was actually a place with dense heaven and earth spirit qi. As the capital of the country, Shangjing's geographical location was excellent. It was located at the intersection of the plains and the mountains. The steep mountains, the rushing rivers, and the fertile plains were all in one place. It was a treasure trove of wind and water. It was also the best place to build the capital. There were 2 mountain ranges in the vicinity. The Taihang mountain range ran from the north to the south and was majestic. The Yan mountain range ran from the west to the east and was vast and boundless. To the west was Taihang mountain and to the north was Mount Yan. Mount Yan was still a bit small and not grand enough, so Qin thought for a moment and directly eliminated Mount Yan. Now that the tourism industry was developed, places with slightly better scenery were all listed as scenic spots. It was estimated that when the big cat was looking for a place to cultivate, it also took a lot of effort to find Mount Amei. Qin flew and searched. It wasn't until he flew over the Spirit Mountain in the western suburbs of Shangjing that he finally found a remote place with dense heaven and earth spirit qi. This mountain range was steep, and it was estimated to be more than 2,000 meters above sea level. The top of the mountain was already covered with a thick layer of snow. Standing on the top of the mountain when the clouds surged, the clouds paved a road and people walked in the sky. It was like a fairyland. Qin looked around, and after confirming that there was no one else around, he sat cross-legged on a large rock at the top of the mountain and began cultivating. As he gradually entered the state, Qin's body seemed to turn into a black hole, and the surrounding heaven and earth spirit qi rushed towards him. Within a radius of tens of meters, there was strangely no wind, like a color photo, and everything seemed to be still. On the top of the snowy mountain, a bright moon hung in the sky, and the surrounding stars were overshadowed. Time flew. When Qin opened his eyes again, the sun on the horizon just happened to show a corner of the clouds. Thousands of clusters of golden arrows burst out from the clouds, and reflected on his body, as if covering him with a golden gauze. Cultivation was dry and boring to begin with, because it was a process that accumulated over time. Qin was not in a hurry. After seeing the sun rise, he immediately got up and left the top of the mountain, because he had to go back to prepare breakfast for the little fellow. Qin Ruoying now also made up her mind to accompany Nian during the day, and find time to cultivate at night. She wanted to let the little fellow deeply feel what was called motherly love. Of course, this kind of love was not without limits. Appropriate love was called doting. Once it went beyond the limit, it became doting. To any child, being spoiled was definitely not beneficial. Qin Ruoying also put in a lot of effort. Although she had only been with Nian for a few days, she was very keen to find a problem that had not yet occurred. Nian was very smart and sensible, and she rarely lost her temper. Although sometimes she also liked to make trouble, more often than not Nian liked to quietly watch cartoons with the big cat. Nian never seemed to be very interested in the outside world. Playing games with her parents, watching cartoons with the big cat. This was all the content of her life. This way of life was absolutely wrong, because she lacked communication with her peers, and also relatively lacked the psychological and ability to socialize. Although the big cat was a monster and its intelligence was far superior to that of a child, it could not speak, so there was no way to communicate with the little fellow. If the child had too little contact with the outside world from a young age, it may lead to an extremely serious consequence. That was, when the child grew up, he or she would become more and more withdrawn. If it was more serious, it would even evolve into a psychological illness, such as low self-esteem, autism, depression, and so on. As a parent, in the child's growth process, it was obvious that they should take the initiative to create opportunities for the child to interact with strangers and unfamiliar environments, to increase the child's ability to socialize and adapt to the environment, and to cultivate a cheerful and optimistic character. Qin Ruoying looked at the little fellow who immediately climbed into bed after breakfast. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that something was wrong, so she quickly told this problem to Qin Shi. And when Qin Shi heard what she said, he immediately realized the seriousness of the situation. After all, Aunt Zhang was old and in poor health, so she rarely took Nian Yan out to play with other children. And after he came back, it seemed that he did not take Nian Yan to play with other children. At most, he let the little fellow go to kindergarten, but after a few days he did not go. No. According to this progress, it seemed that Nian Yan was likely to become more and more withdrawn. She looked very outgoing now, but that was because she stayed by her parents' side all day long. She could not be so introverted in front of her parents, right? What to do? Chapter 133. Walking side by side with me is obviously a tough task for a loner like him. The man in the condom. Humans were social creatures. Some Western scholars even categorized loners who do not socialize with others as antisocial personalities, because this in itself was a sign of morbidity. Being antisocial was different from being alone. Lonely people yearned to socialize with others. They would not be bored with anyone, and they would not even be on guard against everyone. Antisocial people were a kind of personality defect. They usually thought highly of themselves and looked down on others, but their hearts were extremely weak. They were afraid of being stabbed, so they did not want to socialize with others. When they had to socialize with others, antisocial people would also appear to behave strangely and pretentiously. They always gave people a feeling of nervousness. They were actually very pitiful. They did not necessarily have antisocial psychology or violent tendencies, but they definitely felt autistic, lost, inferior, nervous, and depressed. They were unable to communicate with others normally, which made them prefer to be alone and live in isolation from others. There were not many congenital factors for the formation of antisocial personality. It was mainly due to the negative influence of various subjective and objective environments, which caused the psychological distortion caused by long-term depression. For example, if Nian Yan continued like this when she went to primary school in the future, it was likely that she would be ostracized by her classmates because she did not learn to communicate with her peers. She would be treated as an anomaly by her classmates. A little girl who only knew how to chat with cats all day. Was that not weird enough? The results of the survey showed that about 5% to 8% of the children in primary and secondary school groups would be antisocial. And this was already an extremely exaggerated number. Out of 20 people, there would be one antisocial individual. The class was a group, and antisocial children were always unable to integrate into this group. As a result, they were more likely to be ridiculed, ostracized, and criticized by their classmates. This situation would gradually decrease as the child grew older. However, this process was incomparably long for those pitiful children who were reclusive and eccentric. They would endure all kinds of psychological pressure, but in the end, they would only become a stepping stone in the growth process of others. Many years later, who would remember the freak who was ridiculed and teased in the class? Who would care if that freak was doing well now? Qin Shi panicked. After all, he really couldn't cure mental illness. After some serious consideration, he quickly discussed with Qin Ruoying, how about sending Nian Yan to kindergarten? Hearing this, Qin Ruoying immediately nodded. He happened to have the same idea. Although Qin Ruoying wanted to spend more time with Nian Yan, in order to give Nian Yan a healthy and happy environment, it was better to be cautious. As long as it involved their children, any parent would become particularly worried. Even if there was only the slightest possibility, they had to eliminate that possibility in time. The couple reached a consensus. Thus, Qin Shi sat beside the little fellow. Nian Yan, Daddy wants to discuss something with you, okay? The little fellow was busy watching cartoons. When Qin Shi walked over, he happened to block her line of sight. After a hum, she directly lay on her side on the bed and continued to watch cartoons. Seeing this, Qin Shi pretended to be serious and said, Nian Yan, Daddy is talking to you. The little fellow's eyes were full of doubts. After glancing at Qin Shi, she muttered, Papa, you're blocking me. Daddy is talking to you. Pause first or Daddy will be angry. Oh. Qin Shi obviously had some weight in the little fellow's heart. Therefore, after hesitating for a moment, she obediently took the remote control and pressed the pause button. Then she sat up very obediently. Say it, Papa. Seeing that the little fellow was so obedient, Chin-shi nodded very satisfactorily. Then he gently held her in his arms and asked seriously, Nian, do you want to go to kindergarten? However, when the little fellow heard his question, he didn't even think about it and immediately shook his little head like a rattle drum. No, I don't want to go to kindergarten. This was obviously out of Chin-shi's expectation, so he quickly asked, why? Didn't you like kindergarten before? Hearing this, the little fellow pouted and replied loudly, I don't like kindergarten. Perhaps to express her attitude, the little fellow even repeated, I don't like kindergarten. I don't like it. She didn't play her cards according to common sense and Chin-shi was confused. In the past she clearly wanted to go to kindergarten, but now she suddenly didn't want to go. She changed her mind too quickly. Chin-shi had no choice but to patiently persuade her. Nian, kindergarten is very fun. The teachers teach you to draw, put on little red flowers for you and classmates play games with you. Why don't you want to go? Hearing Chin-shi's words, the little fellow instantly exploded. She didn't know why she suddenly became muddle-headed. After pushing Chin-shi's arm away, she lay on the bed and rolled left and right, constantly muttering, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. I don't like kindergarten. Chin-shi was stunned. When did Nian become like this? She was simply a naughty child. Was there really a problem with his teaching methods? He still remembered that when he first came back, Nian was very obedient and sensible. How long had he been taking care of Nian? How did he raise the child like this? Thinking of this, Chin-shi couldn't help but fall into deep reflection. Seeing that the little fellow had flipped out, Qin Ruiying also sat next to her. After gently helping the little fellow up, she patiently asked, Nian, can you tell us why you don't want to go to kindergarten? After hearing this question, the little fellow was stunned for a moment. But right after that she burst into tears. This time Qin Ruiying also panicked. She quickly took her into her arms and comforted her softly. Nian, don't cry. If you don't want to go, we won't force you. But you have to tell us why you don't want to go, right? The little fellow cried miserably. Seeing this, Chin-shi hurriedly went to the bathroom and brought her a hot towel. The husband and wife worked together and spent a great deal of effort to stop the little fellow from crying. After a while, the little fellow sobbed, pursed her lips and said very sadly, I don't want to go to kindergarten. I want to be with Papa and Mama. Hearing this, Qin Ruiying couldn't help but look at Chin-shi and instantly understood the reason. This poor child. She was raised by Aunt Zhang alone before and her parents were never by her side. Therefore, when the little fellow had her parents again, she didn't want to be separated from them for a moment. And this was obviously the root cause of her recent muddle-headedness. Since the child said so, it was obvious that she couldn't go to kindergarten. Qin Ruiying held Nian in her arms and thought for a while. Suddenly she said to Chin-shi, how about we change the way? What way? Look at the cold weather, there aren't many parents who would bring their children out to play. Nian doesn't want to go to kindergarten. It's definitely not a way to go on. How about this? Let's open a bookstore or a restaurant or a coffee shop so that Nian can meet many strangers. Chapter 134. Open a shop? This idea seems to be good. Of course, if it was other seasons there would be no need to go through so much trouble. He could just take Nian out to Hohai every day. Over time she would naturally meet some new friends. But unfortunately it was winter now and it was winter in the north. The temperature was low and the wind was strong. Before the ice skating rink was officially opened, the popularity of Shikahai during the day was very bleak. Of course, the so-called bleak popularity refers to the daytime. Hohai was really lively at night. If Samleton's bar street was trendy, then Hohai's bar street would undoubtedly be artistic. A small alley near the sea. There was no noisy music. The melodious singing coupled with the unique charm of the old Shangjing was definitely a melodious elegy in the modern city. It was really good to open a shop in this kind of artistic and fresh place. Anyway, they were idle all day. Opening a shop to take care of the little guy could also add some fun to their life. Thinking about it, it was also quite good. But the question was, what kind of shop should they open? Chin-shi didn't have any ideas. Since it was Qin Ruiying's suggestion, he might as well listen to her opinion. So he smiled and asked, what kind of shop do you want to open? Hearing this, Qin Ruiying frowned and pondered. They weren't short of money. Opening a shop was purely for fun and to create a new living environment for the little guy. The business couldn't be too good. If it was too good, they wouldn't have time to take care of the child. But it couldn't be too bad. If it was too bad, they could only stare blankly at the door all day. It was better not to open. After thinking for a while, Qin Ruiying couldn't think of a reason, so she proposed to go out and look at the shops around. Hohai Bar Street was formed after the end of the SARS, more than 10 years ago at an incomprehensible speed. She still vaguely remembered that there were only a few small pubs here before. But now looking around, Hohai was densely packed with small pubs on both sides. The family of 3 walked around Hohai. The more Qin Ruiying looked, the more dissatisfied she was. She saw this, but he didn't say anything. When the little fellow ran to the railing and checked whether the lake water was frozen, she suddenly smiled and said, "Ying, we only opened the shop to let Nian come into contact with more people. As for what kind of shop we open, it doesn't really matter." Hearing this, Qin Ruiying couldn't help but be stunned. After carefully thinking about Shi's words, she said with some hesitation, "I was wrong. Most of the places here are bars. It's really not suitable to open a bookstore." In fact, Qin Ruiying wanted to open a bookstore the most. However, Hohai was still a relatively mature business circle. Hohai Bar Street's reputation was comparable to Sanlitun and Workers' Sports Complex. Therefore, other than bars, there were only a few tea houses, restaurants, food stalls, and so on. There weren't even many supermarkets. Fame had already determined that other shops couldn't survive here. Therefore, Qin Ruiying thought for a long time, but still couldn't think of what kind of shop they should open. She saw her hesitation and suggested with a smile, "Didn't you see a tea house with a shop for sale sign outside? How about we take it over?" Tea house. Qin Ruiying was a bit surprised, but after seeing Shi's serious expression, she had to seriously consider this proposal. In fact, compared to a tea house, Qin Ruiying was more inclined to a coffee shop. But unfortunately, coffee was a Western culture. Therefore, after coming to Hohai, a place with a strong folkloric flavor, it was somewhat unsuitable. When they were walking along the road, they already saw several closed coffee shops. Huaxia had a tea culture since ancient times. Tea was popular in the Tang dynasty and flourished in the Song dynasty. From the emperor to the literati to the common people, there was no one who didn't like tea. In the eyes of many young people, the style of coffee seemed to be much higher than tea. But in fact, coffee, cocoa, and tea were known as the 3 non-alcoholic drinks in the world. Silk, porcelain, and tea, these were also the business cards that Huaxia handed to the world. Before the bar street in Hohai rose, there were many tea houses here. Every summer, Hohai Lake was wide, the water was sparkling, willows were hanging on both sides of the lake, lights were shining, and the palace walls and minarets in the distance were reflected in the water. From time to time there were pleasure boats gently rowing. If at this time there was a pot of good tea sitting quietly by the lake and carefully tasting it, wouldn't it be pleasant? This was a kind of cultural charm belonging to Huaxia and also belonging to Hohai. Qin Ruiying was moved. Therefore, the couple immediately reached an agreement, called the little girl, and turned to the tea house with a shop for sale sign. The owner was a middle-aged man in his 40s. After hearing Shi's intention, he immediately enthusiastically introduced the tea house to them. The size of the tea house was not bad. The lobby was about 70 to 80 square meters, and there was a small courtyard of more than 50 square meters in the back. The overall decoration was very antique, exquisite, and elegant. The shop was the owner's own because the business of the tea house was not very good. The owner did not intend to continue to operate, and was ready to rent out the shop to collect rent. The price of a shop in Hohai was not cheap. The better location of the shop, the rent for 1 square meter fluctuated around 300 yuan. In other words, such a large shop, the monthly rent would be at least 40,000 yuan. In a year, the rent alone was close to 500,000 yuan. It was really like an inch of land was worth an inch of gold. Because the owner was the landlord, the transfer fee was saved, but the renovation fee still had to be paid. She had a lot of money, but he did not want to be a sucker, so he negotiated the price with the owner. After some bargaining, the owner agreed to only charge 200,000 yuan for the renovation fee. The stock in the shop would be calculated separately, and the rent would be 35,000 a month, paid once a year, plus a month's deposit. In order to prevent Chin-shi from saying that he was randomly charging the renovation fee, the owner even took out his previous renovation fee list, repeatedly saying that he spent 500,000 to renovate the shop, and if Chin-shi rented it to someone else, he would receive 400,000 just for the transfer fee. Although he said so, it was up to Chin-shi whether he believed it or not. After all, this was not a small matter, so the owner thought that the young couple would go back to discuss it. But what he did not expect was that the young couple did not hesitate for long. The two simply discussed a few words and directly decided to rent. The price was agreed, then the next step was simple: look at the property certificate, sign the contract, clear the account, check the goods, pay the money, and a happy cooperation. The transfer of a shop was actually a very troublesome matter. If you want to change the name of the shop or change the type of business, then you have to let the owner go to the Trade and Commerce Bureau to cancel the original business license, and then Chin-shi would go to register again. Chin-shi found it troublesome, so he was too lazy to even change the name. Seeing that he was so straightforward, the owner signed an agreement with him, and then handed over the original business license to him. Therefore, in less than a day, this tea house, which was not far from Dongming Alley and adjacent to Hohai, had completely changed owners. Chingy Tea House. This was the new business of the family of three. While Chin-shi was signing the contract with the owner, the little girl took the big cat to wander around the tea house, from time to time touching here and there, as if she was very interested in this place. When Qin Ruiying saw her like this, her heart immediately felt relieved. Chapter 135. The next day the little fellow was woken up by the sound of bricks colliding. She opened her eyes in a daze, climbed to the window, and found that a group of strangers were moving bluestones into the yard. Chin-shi stood in the yard and directed the workers. When Qin Ruiying saw the little fellow get up, she immediately came to her and prepared to help her get up. "Mama, what are they doing?" "The yard is broken. Papa asked someone to repair it. After that you can play in the yard again. Papa is so nice." Hearing this, Qin Ruiying immediately pinched her little face and asked, "What about Mama?" "Mama is so nice." The little fellow flattered, and Qin Ruiying immediately laughed. After gently picking up the little fellow from the bed, she smiled and said, "Let's go. Mama will take you to wash up." To repair the yard, first of all, the broken bluestone slabs had to be swept out, and then the mud from outside to fill the big hole. After that, the bluestone slabs could be laid again. The workers made a lot of noise. Qin Xueqing frowned and came out to take a look. Then she slammed the door and went back to the east wing. Recently, she and Qin Yongyan had been completely obsessed with cultivation. They often didn't even go out for a whole day. Qin-shi didn't ask them to eat now. Anyway, after the family of three had eaten, Qin-shi would put all the leftovers into the insulated cabinet. When Qin Xueqing and Qin Yongyan were hungry, they naturally knew to eat by themselves. After breakfast, Qin-shi briefly explained to the person in charge of the decoration company that they must finish the work today. After that, the family of three went out. The original owner of the tea house was a very particular person. When he left yesterday, he had carefully cleaned the tea house. After a brief check, Qin-shi took out a sign from the bar and hung it outside the door. It was open. He didn't even change the sign. He didn't know if there would be any old customers. Qin-shi sat at the bar and seriously warned the little girl to be sweet and polite, and to take the initiative to greet the guests when they came in. After the little fellow listened to his incessant warning, she nodded her little head numbly. It was unknown whether she understood or not. Qin-shi had already seen the boss's account book before, and the business was indeed not good. Because it was winter, there was basically no business in the tea house in the morning. It was only slightly better in the afternoon. Many customers who came to the bar because of its reputation would sit in the tea house with their friends for a while, chatting and playing cards before the bar opened. The tea house was open and even the signboard was still the same. However, Qin-shi had overlooked a very important issue. That was, opening a tea house required a certain amount of connections. The tea house itself was a business of acquaintances, and the gathering and dispersing of qi were closely related to the boss. A successful tea house must have a boss who could be called a social expert. The customers came for the boss, but they also dispersed because of the boss. Therefore, there was a saying often heard in the tea houses that business was good as long as the boss was there. If the boss was not there, there would be no ghost. On the right side of the lobby, There was a bookshelf next to the window seat, on which were some of the world's classics that the former boss had bought before. Qin Ruing casually flipped through, then picked up a book called Love in the Time of Cholera, and sat in the booth to read it. Seeing this, She poured a cup of tea and asked the little fellow to bring it to her. Yin, come bring a cup of tea to mommy. Be careful, don't burn yourself. In order to make it convenient for the little fellow to take, She specially chose a hand cup, and only mixed 2/3 of the water. The little fellow held the cup with both hands and walked very slowly. When she carefully came to Qin Ruing's side, she sweetly shouted, "Mommy, drink tea." Qin Ruing read carefully, so when the little fellow called her, she found that the little fellow was still holding the teacup, so she quickly took the teacup from the little fellow's hand, and at the same time did not forget to praise, "Ah, Yin is so good." The little fellow was happy and seemed to think that it was a very pleasant thing to serve tea to others, so she immediately turned and ran to the bar, looked up at Shi and asked, "Papa, when will the guest come?" Don't worry, take your time. The most important thing to do business is to be patient." Shi smiled and held her in his arms, and then the father and daughter sat behind the bar and chatted. The door opened at 9 o'clock in the morning. After waiting for 2 hours in boredom, the family of 3 finally welcomed their first guest after the opening. To Shi's surprise, the guest did not belong to the middle-aged group, but was a young girl. The girl stood outside the door and hesitated for a moment. After looking at the business sign outside the door, she pushed the door and walked in. She wasn't very old and looked to be about 20 years old. She should be at the age of a down jacket and jeans, but now she was wearing a long coat that did not match her temperament at all, and a combination of pantyhose and boots on the lower half of her body. The girl had put on makeup. Perhaps it was due to her poor technique, but her makeup gave off a strange feeling. Obviously she was a natural hibiscus, but she had to paint a snake with legs and dress herself up a little. Of course, it would make people feel a little strange. The girl entered the tea house, looked around and saw that the right side of the booth was already occupied, so she went directly to the left side of the lobby by the window. Seeing this, Shi quickly patted the little fellow, indicating that it was time for her to receive the guest. They opened the shop to train the little fellow's social skills. If the little fellow did not perform well, then it would not be too late for him to come forward. Both parents were here, so the little fellow did not seem to be afraid of strangers. After receiving Shi's signal, she ran over. "Sister, what do you want to drink?" Looking at the 4 or 5-year-old little girl in front of her, Qiao Yuan could not help but be stunned. This tea house was really strange. The waiter was actually an innocent and lovely child. Seeing that she did not speak, the little fellow thought that she did not hear her, so she asked sweetly again, "Sister, what do you want to drink? Papa said that we have everything here." Hearing this, Qiao Yuan could not help laughing and her mood became much better. After glancing at the price list on the table, Qiao Yuan smiled at the little fellow and said, "Then black tea, thank you." The little fellow nodded blankly as if she did not understand what black tea was. But that was not important. What was important was that they had a guest. So the little fellow immediately turned around and ran back, shouting excitedly as she ran, "Papa! Sister wants black tea. Black tea." The little fellow's voice was very loud and sounded very excited. Even Qin Ruing was startled by her. "Okay, I got it." She smiled and patted the little fellow's head, then took out a packet of Kimun black tea from behind the bar counter. Because she was the first customer after the opening, She injected a trace of spiritual energy into the tea when he made it. Qiao Yuan would never have dreamed that she would be able to win the first prize by randomly finding a tea house before going to work. "Sister, drink tea." The little fellow's little mouth was very sweet, and her cute appearance was enough to make people melt, so Qiao Yuan was instantly captivated by her. Qiao Yuan hesitated for a moment, then quickly took out her phone and asked Shi behind the bar counter, "Boss, can I take a photo with your daughter?" Shi nodded and smiled, "As long as she agrees." Seeing that she was so popular, the little fellow was so happy that she could not close her mouth. After taking a photo with Qiao Yuan, the little fellow ran back to Shi's side, a little embarrassed. Then she burrowed into his arms, rubbing left and right and acting coquettishly. Seeing the little fellow's proud look, Shi could not help but nod in satisfaction. Opening a shop allowed the little fellow to interact with strangers, and also allowed her to gain recognition through her performance. They didn't seem to lack money at all, and most importantly, they had a well-behaved and sensible child. Thinking about it, Qiao Yuan couldn't help but have a trace of envy in her eyes. Perhaps she realized that she had lost her composure, but when she saw Qin Shi look in her direction, Qiao Yuan immediately lowered her head, then picked up the black tea on the table and drank it. The black tea entered her mouth and the taste was mellow. But when it slowly seeped into her throat, Qiao Yuan faintly felt that there was a delicate fragrance going from her throat to her stomach. The taste was extremely mellow, fragrant, and sweet, which was simply intoxicating. After tasting it carefully, Qiao Yuan felt that her whole person was much more awake, and there was a sudden feeling of enlightenment in front of her. She held the cup in front of her and carefully studied the black tea. What kind of tea is this? Why is it so delicious? Seems to have the effect of refreshing the mind? Qiao Yuan took another sip, and after tasting it carefully, she suddenly thought of something and quickly looked at the price list on the table. This cup of tea is so delicious, it must be very expensive, right? Thinking of this, she couldn't help but feel a little nervous. She had just looked at the price list, and if she remembered correctly, the cost here wasn't very high. However, the taste of this cup of tea made Qiao Yuan suspect that she had just seen wrongly, so she quickly picked up the price list and carefully looked at it. The cheapest was the vegetarian tea, 20 yuan per cup. Bilyuakun, 28 yuan per cup. Himun black tea, 38 yuan per cup. And the most expensive Wui de Hong Pao, only 68 yuan per cup. 38 yuan? A cup of caramel macchiato at Starbucks cost more than 30 yuan, and such a mellow black tea only cost 38 yuan? For some reason, Qiao Yuan felt like she had picked up a bargain. If Qin Shi knew what she was thinking now, he would probably be unable to help but chuckle. The tea leaves of this kind of tea house were usually bought wholesale from the tea market, one bag at a time. A bag of 500 grams and a cup of 20 kilograms. Each cup of tea only required about 3 to 4 grams of tea leaves, and some people had a strong taste, so they put more than 10 grams of tea leaves. On average, one bag of tea leaves could make at least 100 cups of tea. Of course, this didn't mean that the tea house was a profiteering industry. After a little careful calculation, one would know that this tea house was definitely a loss-making business. The profits were high, but the corresponding rent, water, and electricity were also very expensive. The rent here was 35,000 yuan. How many cups of tea would it take to earn that much? Moreover, customers could sit here for a whole day after ordering a cup of tea. The tea house was only so big, so even if the business was booming, there was no way to receive more customers after it was full. Chapter 137. Lin Xian. Qin Ruiying hadn't seen Lin Xian for many years, so her impression of Lin Xian was still in college. However, Qin Shi's memory of Lin Xian was not long ago. The cruise ship, the dock, the palm trees. On that sunny afternoon, Lin Xian stood under the shade of the tree and watched the father and daughter get into the car and leave. She stood there for a long time. In fact, the Lin Xian of the past was quite similar to the girl just now. A girl from a small county came to Zhonghai, an international first-tier city, to study and work. At that time, Lin Xian had a kind of maturity that was incompatible with her peers. Of course, that so-called maturity in retrospect was also a kind of childishness. When all the impurities were washed away, the girl just now might become like Lin Xian now. Qin Shi thought about something thoughtfully. Qin Ruiying glanced at Qin Shi and suddenly asked with a smile, "What? Have you met Lin Xian?" Hearing this, Qin Shi immediately nodded and replied, "Yes, when I first came back I asked her about you. When Fang Lei got married, she asked Nian Yin to be her flower girl." Fang Lei is married? Thinking about it carefully, I haven't seen them in a long time. Do you think we should go back to Zhonghai to meet them? When do you want to go? Qin Ruiying thought for a moment, looked down at the little girl in her arms and said, "Let's talk about it next spring. The weather is cold, I don't want to go." Qin Shi nodded, but then he suddenly thought of something and quickly took out his phone. "Oh, I almost forgot. Your back is such a big thing, we should tell Auntie Zhang the good news first." While speaking, Qin Shi opened WeChat. After sending a video call request to Auntie Zhang, Qin Shi handed the phone to Qin Ruiying. Qin Ruiying paused for a moment and quickly took the phone. The video call request rang a few times, then it went through with a beep. Auntie Zhang seemed to be busy with something. The screen showed the ceiling of her house. After she accepted the video call, she probably put the phone on the table. "Yo, stinky brat, you finally remembered to give this old woman a call?" Auntie Zhang's granddaughter was crying. She was so busy comforting her granddaughter that she didn't have time to look at the phone. Qin Ruing looked at the screen. She didn't see Auntie Zhang, so she hesitated for a moment before saying gently, "Auntie, it's me, Ying." Auntie was stunned. Then he grabbed the phone on the table and shouted at the camera with a surprised face, "Oh my God! Ying, when did you come back?" Seeing that familiar face, Qin Ruing was also slightly excited. She quickly replied, "I just came back a few days ago. I'm discussing with Qin Shi when to go to Chengdu to visit you." "Thank God you're finally back. Where are Qin Shi and Yan Yan?" Come, let me see your family." Hearing Auntie Zhang's request, Qin Ruing raised the phone high and then asked Qin Shi and the little girl to come over. In the video, Qin Ruing leaned close to Qin Shi and Qin Shi held the little girl in his arms. Both of them looked at her with a smile. The little girl poked her head out and saw Auntie Zhang in the video. She immediately shouted excitedly, "Grandma, Grandma." As she shouted, she waved her little hand and motioned for Auntie Zhang to look at her. Your family is finally reunited." Looking at the family of three in the video, Auntie Zhang's words were also quite emotional. After so many twists and turns, they were finally reunited. Qin Ruing and Auntie Zhang talked about old times, and Qin Shi held the little girl and listened with a smile. The two of them chatted for more than half an hour. When Auntie Zhang had to prepare lunch for her granddaughter, Qin Ruing reluctantly said goodbye to her. She had already made an appointment with Auntie Zhang to go to Chengdu during the new year. Because of the tea house, Qin Shi casually ordered a few dishes at the Chinese restaurant next door for lunch. One for them and the other for the two cultivation maniacs at home. The business in the afternoon was indeed better. Before 3 o'clock, there were already 4 or 5 tables of customers. Qin Ruing did the math. The average cost per table was 80 yuan. At least 15 tables of customers were needed to earn back the daily rent. This did not include the artificial water and electricity. Of course, they did not want to make money. Qin Ruing did the math just for fun. The owner of the tea house was like an immortal couple, the lively and lovely daughter, and the black cat that lay on the bar all day long. In just 3 days, many people knew that the owner of the Qingyi tea house had changed. It was not because Qin Shi was really so eye-catching, but because of the sign hanging at the door. "This tea house does not provide chess and card entertainment." This tea house had become a pure tea house. The so-called tea house did not provide chess and card entertainment, but only provided tea and a relatively quiet and relaxing environment. Many people came to the tea house to play cards, so when Qin Shi hung the sign outside that no chess and card entertainment was provided, the business of the tea house went downhill. However, there were gains and losses in everything. The chess and card tea house became a pure tea house. There were fewer individual customers but more frequent customers. For example, Qiao Yuan. Since the day Qiao Yuan drank the black tea here, she would come to the tea house at 11 o'clock every morning. Then she would order a cup of black tea and quietly sit on the sofa to read the book she brought. When she did not receive a call, Qiao Yuan would sit in the tea house all day and would not leave until 6 o'clock in the evening. Every day was like this, so in just a few days she was very familiar with Nian Yan. Qin Shi found out from chatting with her that Qiao Yuan was a junior at Beijing Normal University. The reason she came here every day was that she recently found a part-time job in Hohai. Her part-time job seemed a bit strange. After 3 days she only went to work on the first day. For the next 2 days she sat in the tea house all day reading and only left in the afternoon. Although Qiao Yuan did not say what her part-time job was, Qin Shi thought it might be related to the bar. This afternoon, including Qiao Yuan, there were only 3 tables of customers in the tea house. Suddenly, there was a sudden sound of tires braking on the street outside, followed by a burst of shouting. A customer was alarmed, so he curiously went out of the tea house to take a look. When he went out, he saw a large group of people standing in front of a bar not far away. It was not the opening hours of the bar, and those people did not look like they were here to drink. Some of them seemed to be here to make trouble. This was Hohai Sijio City under the emperor's feet. It was strange that someone dared to make trouble here in broad daylight. The customer looked around and then asked his friends to come out and take a look. Qin Ruoying saw this and followed him out. Qiao Yuan sat by the window so she wanted to see the situation outside through the window. But at this moment her phone suddenly rang, giving her a fright. Qiao Yuan answered the phone. After listening to a few words, her face changed greatly. She quickly hung up the phone, stood up from her seat and looked around the tea house at a loss. She ran directly to the bar and then said to Qin Shi with a pleading face, "Boss, can you let me hide here for a while?" Chapter 139. Qin Shi calmly looked at the group of young people in front of him. Among the group of young people, the youngest was about 20 years old and the oldest was no more than 25 years old. They were all dressed very fashionably and a few of them were very handsome. However, they did not stand properly, and the moment they opened their mouths were full of obscenities, inadvertently giving people a frivolous and vulgar feeling. The leader was about 24 or 25 years old. After his companions surrounded the door of the tea house, he stood in front of Qin Shi with a cigarette in his mouth. As if he wanted to create momentum for himself, the young man didn't hold back and directly blew a smoke ring at Qin Shi. However, he didn't expect the wind to be very strong today. So just as he blew out the smoke ring, a sudden gust of wind blew the smoke ring directly into his face. Choked by the smoke, the young man immediately lowered his head and couldn't help but rub his eyes. As a result, the imposing manner that he had deliberately created was destroyed and completely disappeared. This young man was called Wang Hao, and he was also a famous person in Shangjing's nightclub circle. Whenever it was nighttime, it was time for Wang Hao to shuttle through the major bars. Recently, Huaxia suddenly set off a hip-hop craze, just like the rock craze of the 80s and 90s, which suddenly became popular all over the country. Wang Hao was one of the first underground rappers. After catching up with the hip-hop craze, he was also in the limelight in Shangjing. Most of the bars in Hohai were small bars, so Wang Hao wasn't familiar with this area. The reason why he brought people here today was because one of his brothers was cheated of money by a bartender. His brother was related to him and just came out from his hometown to mingle with him. Before, he was a very honest person and didn't see much of the world, so he didn't understand the twists and turns of the bar. After chatting with the keyboard player online for a while, the brother suddenly became hot-headed and wanted to ask the girl to come out and meet. Coincidentally, the bartender that the boss arranged for him was Qiao Yuan. In terms of appearance, Qiao Yuan's appearance was definitely the best among the group of bartenders. As a young man who had just come to Shangjing, when had he ever been in close contact with a beauty of this level? Therefore he was mesmerized by Qiao Yuan at that time. Qiao Yuan didn't say much to him before he excitedly ordered some wine. The more he drank, the more confused he became. In the end, he directly opened a big order of 20,000 yuan. 20,000 yuan, 20% for the keyboard, 40% for the bartender, and another 40% for the boss. After the order was confirmed, Qiao Yuan would get 8,000 yuan. Usually, the bill would only be settled once every half a month or a month. That was because if the customer called the police, the bill would be refunded. The glass seemed to be tempered glass, and the stone only made a loud collision sound when it hit it. The stone fell to the ground, but the glass didn't move. The young man was not convinced. After fiercely staring at Qin Shi, he picked up the stone from the ground again. But this time he didn't smash the stone out. Instead, he stood directly in front of the glass window with the stone. Bang! 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 The young man held the stone and smashed the glass with all his strength. Qin Ruiying sat on the chair next to Qiao Yuan with the little girl in her arms. The little girl shrank in Qin Ruiying's arms. This movement not only scared the little girl but also the guests in the tea house. Seeing that the young man kept smashing the glass with the stone, the guests retreated to the corner. This group of young people was simply lawless. The young man smashed the stone for a while, but there was still no trace of damage on the glass. At this moment, Qin Shi spoke. "That's tempered glass. Be careful, don't hurt your own hand, and come back to me later to pay for the medical expenses." As soon as he finished speaking, the young man picked up the stone and smashed it again as if he didn't hear him at all. Bang! The loud collision sounded again. Immediately after, the young man suddenly let out a wail that sounded like a pig being slaughtered. Everyone hurriedly turned to look, only to see him covering his right hand with his left hand and constantly shouting. Blood dripped down from his fingers. It seemed that Chinshi was right. Chapter 141. After hearing that Qiao Yuan had called the police, Wang Hao and his men dispersed. Gathering a crowd to make trouble? No, they just came to Hohai to see the scenery. Qiao Yuan was still a little confused, but seeing that Wang Hao and his men hadn't left, she didn't dare to run around and could only obediently follow Qinshi back to the tea house. After Qinshi returned to the tea house, the guests at the two tables gave him a thumbs up and praised, "Boss, you're amazing, you're a real man." Not to mention who was right and who was wrong, just Qinshi blocking the entrance of the tea house by himself was enough to make them applaud and praise him. This boss was very competent. Qin Ruiying whispered to the little girl at the bar, making her giggle from time to time. After seeing that Qinshi had returned, the little girl immediately rubbed against Qin Ruiying's arms and reached out for Qinshi to carry her. After Qinshi picked her up from Qin Ruiying's arms, the little girl asked sweetly, "Papa, what were you doing outside?" Papa was reasoning with them. Why? Did they scare you? Hearing this, the little girl immediately shook her head and pouted, "No, I don't like them." Children were sometimes very strange, and the first impression a stranger left on them was very important. If this person was someone they liked, then they would immediately be very kind to this person as if they were familiar with him. But if this person wasn't someone they liked, then sorry, the child would stay as far away as possible. Unless their parents were around, they wouldn't get too close. The group of people outside was obviously not the little girl's favorite. Qinshi touched the little girl's little face and said with a smile, "This is our home. If you don't like them, then Papa won't let them in, okay?" The little girl happily acted coquettishly. At this time, Qiao Yuan slowly walked over. After hesitating for a moment, she said very embarrassedly, "Boss, I'm sorry for the trouble." After saying that, Qiao Yuan suddenly bowed to Qinshi. Before Qinshi could say anything, Qin Ruiying waved at her and smiled. "It's nothing. Why don't you come over and have a chat?" Hearing the lady boss's words, Qiao Yuan obediently sat beside her. "How long have you been in this business?" "Half a month." "How much did you earn?" Qiao Yuan was stunned for a moment. Then she said hesitantly, "If this order is included, it should be more than 20,000 yuan. However, the bill hasn't been paid yet. Why do you want to do this? If I remember correctly, you are a student of Beijing Normal University, right?" Qin Bei is from Beijing Normal University, and Beijing Normal University is known as one of the 4 famous universities in Beijing. It can even be ranked in the top 20 in the country. Do you think it's appropriate for a student from Beijing Normal University to be a prostitute? Qin Ruiying's voice was very soft and gentle, but every word pierced Qiao Yuan's heart. Qiao Yuan lowered her head in silence. After a long while, her tears flowed down silently. Seeing that his wife was about to talk about life ideals with others, Qinshi held the little fellow and sat in the center of the lobby, leaving some private space for them. Qiao Yuan sobbed in a low voice. Qin Ruiying waited for a moment, then took out a few tissues and handed them to her. "Can you tell me why?" Qiao Yuan took the tissues and wiped her tears. After taking a deep breath, she looked at Qin Ruiying and said sadly, "My father is sick. He needs money. I've done a lot of work, but I can't make any money. Someone recommended me to work in a KTV. I was afraid, so I didn't go. But I really need money, so they recommended me to be a prostitute." Qiao Yuan's family was very ordinary. Her father was a middle school teacher and her mother was an elementary school teacher. Their income was not high. They relied on her father's tuition classes to earn some extra money. Their family barely reached the standard of a well-off family. She was a very happy girl. Although her family was not rich, she did not have to worry about food and clothing. Her family was happy. She could be regarded as a pretty girl in a small family. Qiao Yuan also worked hard. She was the top liberal arts scholar in her county during the college entrance examination. However, sometimes the reality was more cliché than stories. After all, life was like an electrocardiogram. If it was smooth sailing, it meant that you were dead. 3 years ago, Qiao Yuan's father was diagnosed with chronic uremia. So there were only two paths left in front of them: lifelong dialysis or kidney transplant. The price of dialysis was not too expensive. The charge was slightly different in each place. The price of a single dialysis was about 400 yuan. A patient had to undergo dialysis at least 3 or 4 times a week, about 13 times a month. It cost 5,200 yuan, about 60,000 yuan a year. 60,000 yuan didn't sound like much. However, for an ordinary family in a small county, this was already a huge expense. Because of his health, Qiao Yuan's father was forced to close the tuition classes. However, he did not quit. Instead, he insisted on going to work every day. Qiao Yuan's father often said, Qiao, don't worry about family matters. Just study hard. When you graduate and find a good job, Dad can enjoy life. This illness was not life-threatening for a while, but it would put a lot of financial pressure on a family. So every time Qiao Yuan returned home, she would feel that her parents had aged a lot. It was also because of this that Qiao Yuan worked part-time while studying hard to earn scholarships since her freshman year. She had done many jobs such as waitress, tutor, courier, and part-time model. Part-time model was the fastest way to earn money, but this kind of good thing was not common. In fact, she had the qualifications to become a contract model, but Qiao Yuan did not forget that she was still a student. So she decisively refused. She wanted to give her father a kidney transplant, but it was a sky-high price. The kidney source started at 200,000 yuan, and the surgery cost 50,000 to 60,000 yuan. After the kidney transplant was successful, he would need to take anti-rejection drugs, which cost about 10,000 yuan a month. After half a year, she would have to pray that there would be no infection or rejection. Otherwise, the condition might worsen. Moreover, a kidney source was not easy to find. Although a kidney transplant might not be able to cure him, compared to lifelong dialysis, a kidney transplant was indeed the most ideal treatment. So, Qiao Yuan only wanted to save 300,000 yuan as soon as possible, in case a suitable kidney source appeared in the future and she did not have the money to give her father a kidney transplant. Qiao Yuan was very thrifty. Even the clothes she was wearing were borrowed from her best friend. There were 38 cups of black tea in Qinshi's tea house. If it were not for the fact that the bar saleswoman had to wait near the bar at all times, and sometimes she would wait for a whole day, she would not come in and sit down for a cup of tea. Being a bar saleswoman was indeed very profitable. In addition, she had some beauty. So Qiao Yuan had successfully slaughtered a few fat sheep in just half a month. The money came so easily, but it also made Qiao Yuan feel a sense of guilt. So she saved these people's phone numbers. She had already decided that when her father recovered from his illness, she would return the money to these people one by one and sincerely say, "Thank you." She really could not think of any other way, so, sorry. Qin Ruoying was a very qualified listener. She sat there and quietly listened to Qiao Yuan's story. After Qiao Yuan finished her story, Qiao Yuan could no longer hold it in. She suddenly lay on the bar counter and burst into tears. Perhaps she had been suppressed for too long, so the girl cried very sadly. Seeing this, Qin Ruoying gently put the tissue next to Qiao Yuan. Then she looked at Qinshi thoughtfully. Qinshi saw this and nodded gently at her. With his 5 senses, he could easily determine whether the girl was lying or not. When Qiao Yuan was talking just now, Qinshi was listening quietly by the side. So he was very sure that the girl was not lying. Chapter 142. After listening to Qiao Yuan's story for a few minutes, there was a burst of sirens on the street outside. The Ministry of Public Security's 110 Police Service Standardization Standards clearly stated that police personnel must respond quickly after receiving a police order. Any major threat to the personal and property safety of citizens, emergency call for help. In the city, they must arrive at the scene within 5 minutes. In the suburbs, they must arrive at the scene within 10 minutes. This was a hard indicator, so don't make a false police report. Otherwise, you will be invited to drink tea for a few hours. Seeing that the police came, Qinshi handed the little guy to Qin Ruoying and he walked out with Qiao Yuan. The police car stopped in front of the tea house. The driver was a middle-aged policeman, and the policeman in the passenger seat was younger, about the same age as Wang Hao. At first glance, It was the standard of a civilian police and an auxiliary police. The middle-aged policeman was not polite. After glancing at Wang Hao and his group, he directly asked Qin Shi, "Did you call the police?" Qin Shi nodded. When he was about to explain the situation to the policeman, the middle-aged policeman pointed at Wang Hao and his group and asked, "Is it them?" Hearing this, Qiao Yuan suddenly acted like a class monitor reporting to the teacher. She quickly interrupted and said, "It's them. They just blocked the entrance of the tea house and caused trouble. They even smashed the window." "Did they do anything? Did they suffer any losses?" Qiao Yuan was stunned for a moment. After glancing at the untouched window, she said with some difficulty, "They didn't do anything. It seems that there are no losses. Okay, I got it." The middle-aged policeman nodded, then turned and walked directly across the street. This was a bar street, so there were often some drunk people causing trouble here. As a policeman in the area, he had seen too many, so he was not surprised by these situations. "Who's the leader?" As soon as the middle-aged policeman's voice fell, Wang Hao immediately replied with a smile, "There's no leader. Just a few friends gathering here, chatting and looking at the scenery of Hohai." "Don't give me that. Hurry up and leave. Do what you need to do." The middle-aged policeman glared at him and waved his hand to let them leave. Seeing this, Wang Hao said with some dissatisfaction, "Hey officer, we didn't break the law, right? This is not Zongnanhai. Are we not allowed to hang out here?" "That's right. Isn't this bar street? We still have to wait for the night to drink," one of the lackeys casually added. But when he spoke, his eyes were looking at Hohai, as if he didn't dare to look at the middle-aged policeman. The middle-aged policeman was also a veteran. He naturally knew how to deal with this group of punks, so he immediately said to Wang Hao, "Take out your ID card." Wang Hao didn't seem to hear him clearly. The middle-aged policeman glanced at him, then suddenly saluted him. Then he took out his ID and said seriously, "There have been many robberies around here. In order to ensure the safety of the people, I have the right to interrogate you. Please cooperate with the investigation. Otherwise, I have the right to forcibly summon you. If you have any objections, you can call 110 or 12,389 to complain. This is my police number. Please show me your ID card." Wang Hao was terrified when he saw that the middle-aged policeman seemed to have changed into a different person in an instant. Therefore, he quickly squeezed out a smile and saluted to the policeman. Then he said with a cheeky smile, "Understood, right away, we'll leave right away." After that, he called his brothers and left. The middle-aged policeman saw that he was tactful, so he was satisfied and took back his ID. As a basic policeman, he was also considered to be a very responsible kind, so he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he was going to wait until Wang Hao and his group left. Under the gaze of the middle-aged policeman, Wang Hao had to reluctantly take his group to their car. The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. So before he left, he didn't forget to give Qin Shi a middle finger, and then slowly made a gesture of slitting his neck. Looking at his posture, he seemed to be silently telling Qin Shi that this matter wasn't over yet. The characteristics of hooligans, besides bullying the weak and fearing the strong, were also disgusting. If a business offended them, they wouldn't hurt them, but they would endlessly harass them, making it impossible for them to do business. Qiao Yuan also understood what Wang Hao wanted to express, so she quickly said to Qin Shi, "Boss, I'm sorry. I'll go and explain it to them." After that, she wanted to chase after Wang Hao and his group. This matter had to be resolved. Why not take advantage of the fact that the police were still here and have a good talk with Wang Hao? At most, she would just have to pay for it. However, Qiao Yuan had just taken 2 steps when Qin Shi suddenly pulled her back, then shook his head at her, indicating that she shouldn't go. It had to be said that Qiao Yuan really thought of this matter too simply. Wang Hao was obviously coming for her. Although she didn't know what they wanted to do, it was obviously not for money. There must be another purpose. Seeing that Qiao Yuan was still confused, Qin Shi sighed softly, "Don't go. I think they're not doing it for money but for you as a person." "Me as a person? What do you mean?" "Boss, I don't understand." However, Qin Shi shook his head and didn't explain further. Seeing this, Qiao Yuan could only stand beside Qin Shi obediently. The boss had just saved her, so he shouldn't be a bad person. Listening to him should be the right thing to do. Wang Hao and his group drove 4 cars. They weren't luxury cars, but after the cars started there was a rumbling sound. Obviously they were modified cars and the throttle was changed and the turbine was installed, so when the accelerator was stepped on, there was a deafening roar. As if to demonstrate, when Wang Hao drove past the door of the tea house, he deliberately stepped on the accelerator, making the noise even louder. Qiao Yuan couldn't help but cover her ears. The middle-aged policeman stood silently by the side, looking at Wang Hao and his group with a blank face. He was a policeman, not a traffic policeman, so he couldn't do anything about this kind of thing. Otherwise he would have detained these bastards' cars. Wang Hao rolled down the window, spitting out a mouthful of saliva, then opened his mouth and silently said, F***CKU. Then he gave Qinshi the middle finger again. Changing gears, braking and stepping on the accelerator. After a set of smooth operations, Wang Hao laughed wildly and sped up. The 4 modified cars roared and sped away in an instant. The middle-aged policeman shook his head, as if he was lamenting the degeneration of the world. However, at this moment, Qinshi suddenly waved his arm. Then Wang Hao's car slammed into the railing of Hohai. Bang! In order to send them on their way, Qinshi even broke the railing. Therefore, when Wang Hao's car hit the railing immediately broke and his car flew into Hohai. The skating rink in Hohai usually opened in January. Although some places were already frozen, it wasn't very thick. The car fell into the water, causing a huge splash. The middle-aged policeman was stunned by the scene in front of him. It wasn't until the car slowly sank into the water that he suddenly came back to his senses, and quickly called the auxiliary police to help him save people. It was just a small punishment and a big warning, not really taking their lives. Therefore, in order to prevent any accidents, Qinshi had already considerately opened the car door for Wang Hao while he was still in the air. Even if it doesn't have any effect, there definitely won't be any side effects. Qiao Yuan took the pill skeptically. After glancing at it, she wrapped the pill in a tissue and said to Qinshi solemnly, "Thank you, boss. Go, come Nian Nian, say goodbye to your sister." "Goodbye, sister." Hearing this, the little girl immediately stood on Qinshi's lap and stuck her head out from behind the bar counter. She smiled and waved goodbye to Qiao Yuan. "Goodbye, Nian Nian, sister will come to see you later." Qiao Yuan turned and left with a complicated expression. After leaving the tea house, she couldn't help but look back at the signboard with the words, Qingyi Tea House, written on it. Then, as if she had finally made up her mind, she quickly walked towards the bar. The weather wasn't very good today. It was always gray. Although it wasn't hazy yet, there wasn't even a bit of sunlight in the cold weather. There was no way to cheer people up. After the little episode just now, it was already 4:30 in the afternoon. Perhaps she had been infected by the big cat. The little girl sat on Qinshi's lap and lazily put her chin on the bar counter. She constantly blew with her small mouth, trying to blow a tissue into the air. Qinshi wanted to take her out for a walk, but the little girl pouted and shook her head. It looked like she didn't want to move at all. The TV in the tea house didn't have a broadcasting function, so she couldn't order cartoons. Since she couldn't watch cartoons, she wanted to serve tea to the customers. There weren't many customers, so the little girl was bored to death. Qin Ruoying saw this and smiled gently. "Nian Nian, mommy will tell you a story, okay?" Hearing this, the little girl's eyes suddenly lit up. Mommy's stories were better than daddy's stories. So she immediately climbed from Qinshi's lap to Qin Ruoying's lap. Then she shook Qin Ruoying's arm and smiled. "Mommy, tell me." Sit down first. Mommy will tell you a story. Once upon a time there was a temple on the mountain. Qin Ruoying told the little girl the story of the 3 monks. But before the story was half finished, the door of the tea house was suddenly pushed open. Seeing this, Qinshi interrupted Qin Ruoying's story and said directly to the little girl, "Nian Nian, look, there are guests." Guests? After a few days of getting used to it, the little girl had become familiar with the reception work of the tea house. So when she heard that there were guests, she was so excited that she wanted to jump out of Qin Ruoying's arms. Qin Ruoying was afraid that she would jump and fall, so she had to put her down carefully. The little girl seemed to be very enthusiastic about greeting guests. So when she stepped on the ground, she ran out from behind the bar counter. However, when the little girl ran out of the bar counter and saw the guests, she couldn't help but be stunned. Immediately after, she ran back to the bar counter and hid. Chapter 144. Twins. According to statistics, the average birth rate of twins in the world was 89.1. In other words, out of every 89 pregnant women, there would be one who would give birth to twins. Before the two-child policy was introduced, the number of births per day in Huaxia was around 20,800. If it was accurate to the second, then Huaxia would give birth to a baby every 4.15 seconds. Even with a 1% probability, Huaxia would give birth to 2,000 pairs of twins per day. After the two-child policy was introduced, this number would double. Twins were not a particularly rare existence. However, the little girl was too young, so when she saw two children who looked exactly the same, she was immediately frightened. After she obediently greeted her grandfather, the little girl immediately shrank behind Qinshi, then carefully looked at the twins in front of her. The twins were both boys. They had delicate features and were very cute. Twins generally looked very similar because they were identical twins, so the genes they carried were almost the same. A small number of twins did not look alike, but that was because they were heterozygotic twins. If the mother laid 2 eggs and produced 2 fertilized eggs, then the genes they carried would naturally be different. When they grew up, there would be a clear difference. The twins did look very similar, and the children were still young, so even with Qinshi's eyesight he could only find a few subtle differences. Seeing that the little girl was a little scared, Qinshi picked her up, then smiled at the old man and said, "The children look so similar, how do you usually tell them apart?" Hearing this, the old man laughed and said, "The older brother has a mole behind his earlobe, but the younger brother doesn't, but it's not obvious, so I made a mark on their clothes." After that, the old man asked the 2 children to turn around. Hearing their grandfather's words, the twins obediently turned around and lay on the sofa. At this time, Qinshi realized that there were numbers written on the back of their clothes. On the left was 1 and on the right was 2. Didn't the 18th National Assembly propose to talk about civilization, so I named the children Civilization. The left is the older brother and the right is the younger brother, Xiaowen Xiaoming. Civilization? Qinshi pondered for a moment, then said to the little fellow with a smile, "Come on, Nian Nian, introduce yourself to Grandpa." The little guy hugged Qinshi's neck with one hand and tilted his head to look at the twins. After that, he quickly turned his head and buried his little head in Qinshi's shoulder. Seeing her like an ostrich, Qinshi could only say to the old man apologetically, "Sorry, the child is shy. It's okay. My 2 kids used to be afraid of strangers too. I've gotten used to bringing them out for a stroll." After chatting with the old man for a while, Qinshi suddenly remembered his duty, so he quickly pointed to the price list on the table and said with a smile, "What do you want?" "Vegetarian tea. I have something to do later, so I'll leave after sitting for a while." "All right, please wait a moment." Qinshi returned to the bar with the little fellow in his arms. Qin Ruoying also noticed the little fellow's strange behavior, so she quickly asked, "What's wrong?" She probably hasn't seen twins before, so she's scared. While talking, Qinshi handed the little fellow to Qin Ruoying. Hearing this, Qin Ruoying had to take the little fellow from Qinshi's hands, and then explain to her what twins were. At this time, Qinshi made a cup of tea for the old man. The waiters were on strike, so only he, the boss, had to do it personally. The little fellow rarely dealt with people of the same age. Now there were 2 of them and they looked exactly the same, so naturally she was scared. After listening to Qin Ruoying's explanation, the little fellow nodded as if he understood something. Tilting her head and thinking for a while, she suddenly pouted and asked, "Mommy, why don't I have a sister who looks exactly the same?" Qin Ruoying was amused by her, so she pinched the tip of her little nose and asked, "You want a sister?" Hearing this, the little fellow immediately nodded, then said with anticipation, "I want a sister. A sister can play with me." "You only know how to play." In fact, Qin Ruoying had already guessed why she wanted a sister. It was because she was lonely and there was no one of the same age to play with her. She and Qinshi had no plans to have a second child for the time being, and distant water could not put out a nearby fire, so the best way now was to bring the little fellow out to interact with people of the same age. Thinking of this, Qin Ruoying carried the little fellow, then walked directly to the twins. Qinshi placed the teacup in front of the old man, and was about to turn back to the bar when Qin Ruoying brought the little fellow over. The husband and wife had a tacit understanding, and Qinshi understood her meaning without a word of explanation. Thus, after Qinshi's introduction, The old man also understood the purpose of Qin Ruiying's visit. Every parent hoped that their children would be able to play with their peers because for children under the age of 6, this was something that would only be beneficial and not detrimental. Seeing that the old man agreed, Qin Ruiying did not stand on ceremony, and directly brought the little fellow to the twins, then smiled at the 2 children and asked, "Can you let your sister play with you?" After hearing her words, the older brother sitting on the left heard her, and without discussing with his younger brother, he immediately said, "Okay." Then he looked at the old man and asked, "Grandpa, can we play marbles with our sister?" "Go, don't bully her." "Yo. We won't bully her, we want to protect her." The older brother jumped down from the sofa excitedly, patted his chest and promised. He directly took the little fellow's hand like a little adult and said to the little fellow, "Sister, I'll play with you." The younger brother seemed to be afraid that they would miss him, so he immediately squeezed from behind the older brother. Looking at the younger brother, it seemed that he also wanted to hold the little fellow. Thus, Qin Ruiying handed the little fellow's left hand to him. The 2 brothers were actually more than 2 months older than the little fellow. When the 3 of them stood together, they were half a head taller than the little fellow. The 2 brothers took Nian Nian around the hall. After finding an open space in the corner, they immediately squatted on the ground and took out marbles from their pockets. The little fellow had not played with glass marbles yet. Therefore, when she saw the colorful glass marbles, she was immediately attracted by the glass ball with a strange pattern in the middle. The little fellow grabbed a marble and played with it. Seeing this, the older brother immediately said to her, "Sister, we'll teach you how to play." The children could always play together happily. Qin Ruiying stood beside the 3 little fellows with a smile, quietly watching them play marbles. The little fellow had not played with people of the same age for a long time, so in the beginning she was a little reserved. But after playing for a while, the little fellow gradually let go of herself, and the range of her movements and laughter became louder and louder. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.